Hello, and welcome back to the Alexander Society. This is a show where we've joined together two of the most annoying things that white guys in their 20s could possibly do: host a history podcast and turn everything into a drinking game. I am your retired veteran high school history teacher who's just a little bit too open about my war stories during class, Derek, joined by my student who's going to drop out and enlist next year because he thought my stories sounded like Call of Duty, Tim. How are you doing, Tim?
I'm doing pretty good. You're getting pretty good at these little intros. How about yourself, Derek?
Man, I had a pretty good like a pretty good Christmas, pretty good New Year's.
You lucky some bitch.
It was still rough because I'm still getting used to the new apartment or house or whatever the fuck you call this thing. But
Yeah, I was stuck home, sick as a dog with COVID.
oh yeah, oh man, that sucks.
I'm still kind of recovering. I've still got it's not a super bad cough, but an occasional cough, and then um, again, it just shoots your like endurance and shit. Even though I wasn't down for very long, like I was working for 2 of those days, not even realizing I had COVID. I thought it was a cold or a flu. Then I took a test right before Christmas just to be safe, and then oop, I got Rona. All right, Derek. So what are you drinking tonight?
I'm drinking a bunch of stuff I got for Christmas, just as Christmas presents. For my sipper, this is the weirdest bottle. We'll post it on the Twitter, but this is the weirdest bottle. It's called Delirium Noel, and it's a Belgian ale, and it comes in like this champagne bottle with
I love how you're doing Belgian the episode after I did Belgian.
yeah. It wasn't planned like that, so I'm gonna go ahead and
Although I absolutely love those Belgian beers, and you thought I was going to hate them. So tonight I am drinking some of that Pendleton whiskey you gave me, and then as my shots, and then for my sipper, it's a Oklahoma native brewery called Skydance Brewing. It's ND Time. It's an amber ale. I love amber ales. And so on this podcast, we have a couple of drinking rules to keep us going because, we got to cope somehow with life. Is every time Derek mentions a war business interest, we're going to take a single sip.
yeah, every time the subject of our story today does some action movie shit, which he's going to do a fair few times, we're going to take 3 sips.
And then every time Derek mentions some rich asshat, we'll do what?
We're going to take a shot.
Hell yeah.
And we'll also take a shot at the start of the episode, Mr. Commissioner.
Kampai?
Prost. So, Tim,
Yes, sir.
do you have any veterans in your family?
I think the last one passed away. My great grandfather Bob passed away back in like 2013. I think he was the last like person I would consider a veteran, not someone who served. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I come from a pretty a pretty extensive military family on both sides. Both of my grandfathers, my mom's dad and my dad's dad, were both like career aircraft mechanics in the Air Force. And on my mom's side, uh, that's like there's like 3 or 4 generations of Air Force going back to my great grandfather who was in the Army Air Corps during World War II. So there's a lot of military in my family. The reason I'm asking, um, do you know? Have you ever known any Marines in particular?
I don't usually ask them what branch they were in, just if they've served. Although I know a lot of Marine stereotypes.
Yeah, I've known several Marines, and they're some of the most interesting people you're ever going to meet in your entire life. If they're good people, they're
Watch your crayons.
yeah. If they're good people, they're really good people. If they're not, they're really not. There's not a lot of in between, but if nothing else, you will always have an interesting time around a Marine. And today's topic that we're going to be talking about is going to be a guy that every Marine knows and will recognize and holds with great affection. One of the most, if not the most, decorated Marine in the history of the United States military, a guy named Smedley Darlington Butler. We're bringing him up because around the time that we're recording this, around the time that this episode is going to come out, is going to be the 2-year anniversary of the
January 6th, attempted insurrection. The 2-year anniversary of the insurrection.
yeah, I guess technically by the
An attempted insurrection.
yeah, by the dictionary definition, it was an insurrection. It was just a very poorly done one. But
Yeah, it was. You could see the holes through all the plans.
and that's the thing is that there wasn't really a plan. It was just a mob of angry people directed to go whose anger was just kind of directed at the Capitol building. And so they stormed it, and then once they were inside, they had no idea what they were doing. They didn't have a plan going in. But it's
There was really no plan.
right. And the reason that I bring that up is because that was not the first time that the far right in this country has made a concerted effort to take over the United States government, and it by undemocratic means, that is. And Smedley Butler, who I'm sure most Marines, at least like freshly freshly enlisted or just has didn't really pay attention beyond boot camp. Um, most Marine, a lot of Marines aren't going to know like this extra part of his history because he actually played a very central role in this event that happened in the 1930s. So Smedley Darlington Butler was born on July 30th, 1881, in the town of Westchester, Pennsylvania. His father, Thomas Butler, was a congressman who would eventually go on to become the chairman of the House Naval Affairs Committee, which is actually how a big reason why he actually ends up going into the Marine Corps.
Following in his dad's best interest slash whatever you want to call it.
Not quite. It has more to do with the fact that like he had information on the Marine Corps that other people wouldn't have.
Okay.
Yeah, so that his dad was a congressman. Both sides of his families were Quakers. Do you know what Quakers were or are? I guess.
I think you've told us, but go ahead and remind me because I can't remember.
Yeah, a Quaker is a religious denomination, um, generally considered like back then very much Christian. Today, their theology is kind of loosened on the whole Christian part of it. It's kind of like broadened out into like a general like general spiritualism. But back then, it was still pretty much Christian. Um, and Quakers were hardcore pacifists. They were generally like opposed to um, they've for in a lot of cases, a lot of Quakers have been on the right side of history in American history for since colonization began. Anytime there was
Do you mean right as in the political idea or the correct right?
the correct, like morally correct position, there were a lot of Quakers very heavily involved in like the Underground Railroad, and they've always uh, Quakers have always been like a hotbed of were always a hotbed of abolitionism. They've always been very staunch pacifists and anti-war activists, stuff like that. Um, they're called Quakers because at their meetings, they don't go to church; they go to meetings. That's what they're called. Um, they they kind of their meetings essentially are just they all sit around. There's no preaching or anything. There's no preacher. They all just kind of sit around and kind of sit around in silence, and they just kind of let themselves be filled up with divine inspiration, and they'll stand before the entire congregation, and uh, they're called Quakers because a big thing they like to do is they dance around. Like if they're at these meetings, they'll feel compelled to dance when they feel like they're filled with the light of Christ, that kind of thing.
That's really weird, but I guess I can't judge too hard.
Yeah, and but yeah, it's Pennsylvania was most mainly founded by Quakers early in its history, and Butler's family on both sides, like his father's side, can trace back to at least the American Revolution. His mother's side can trace back to a guy who was friends with the I think William Penn, the guy who founded Pennsylvania. So very old, very established Quaker families in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Despite the fact that they're Quakers and they were supposed to be pacifists, both of their families still had long histories in the U.S. military as well.
Okay.
Both of Smedley's grandfathers had served in a Pennsylvania volunteer regiment during fighting for the Union during the Civil War, and had both fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. And yeah, and then like his on his dad's side, they had an ancestor who fought in the American Revolution, which would have been like a two great grandfather at that point. Um, so yeah, he kind of got raised on these stories from his grandfather and from his family about like the military tradition. Smedley was a really smart kid, but he didn't do well with bookwork. He didn't do homework very well. Couldn't pay attention in class, that kind of stuff. He was a lot more in his element on the football field or on the baseball diamond.
So he was kind of like your average jock kind of stereotype.
Yeah, but he was like a really smart. Like, he was still very intelligent. Like everybody saw, he was very intelligent. And if he did actually do his schoolwork, he blew it out of the wall. Like he was way ahead in he was ahead in everything he did. It's just that like schoolwork in particular, it didn't interest him at all, and so he didn't really do it. Yeah, and from an early age, he was also really interested in the military. Like I said, his parents thought that that was just a phase, and that eventually he would just buckle down and he'd do his schoolwork, and then eventually he'd go on to law school, like his father, or maybe get into business or something like that. But fate had other plans for young Smedley. If you remember from our Lucy Parsons episodes, in 1898, the USS Maine exploded in the harbor in Havana, Cuba, and then a bunch of all of the journalists in the country, they had yellow journalism going on, that kind of thing. They were all blaming the Spanish government and rallying up the American public for vengeance and to go to war. And so later that year, the Spanish American War kicked off, and Smedley was 16 at the time. He tried to enlist in a volunteer regiment from his hometown, but they'd rejected him because he was 16. And yeah, and so after that, he went against his father's wishes. His father told him, "You're not enlisting. You're I'm not letting you do that at all." And so he just kind of ran away, and he traveled to Washington D.C. and he enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps.
He's like, I'm gonna do it anyway, Dad. Fuck you.
Yeah. So I got to explain something real quick. Back then, the Marines were not the same thing that they are now. Um,
Oh, I don't doubt that. It's obviously to have changed over the years.
yeah. So back then, it was a lot smaller. At the time there were less than 2,000 people in the Marine Corps, less than 2,000 servicemen, and anybody who wanted to join the Marine Corps had to take a competitive qualification test. And Smedley lied about his age so that he could take the test. And when he took it, alongside 300 other candidates, he had the second highest score out of anybody there.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah, he was crazy smart. He was crazy good at everything that he did. It's kind of wild. Um, so because he scored so highly, it actually qualified him for officer training. And so instead of just enlisting as a private, he went through officer training, which shockingly, it was just a few months. And just a few months later, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant at the age of 16, which means he wouldn't just be fighting; he would be leading troops. So already, right off the bat, crazy start for this guy.
That's an insane start, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, an insane start. Uh, he would end up spending 3 decades in the Marine Corps. He would be deployed to fight in numerous different wars, most of which, like I said, are not discussed in American public schools.
Which wars specifically?
Yeah, I'm going to get into them. So the first, of course, Spanish American War. First, he was sent to Cuba, where he fought Spanish troops, ostensibly on behalf of Cuban revolutionaries. Though after the war, not really how it worked out. But when he was in Cuba, he would say for the rest of his life, Cuba was the most fun he ever had in his entire life, fighting in Cuba. He almost died several times, whether from being shot or from like some sort of tropical fever. It was miserable fighting. He They were fighting in dense jungle, constant rain. It was a nightmare to fight through, and he had the time of his life. This 16-year-old kid. After that, after the war was over, he got transferred. He was stationed at a garrison in the Philippines, which had just been a Spanish colony, but had transferred over to the United States at the end of the war because the U.S. won that war. And he fought a few battles. At the time, the Filipino people were in revolt against the U.S. Like as soon as the Spanish left, they just turned their guns on American troops because they didn't like the idea of trading in one colonial overlord for another. And the U.S. did some really heinous, evil shit in the Philippines. Like,
You're fooling yourself if you think the Philippines is the only place we've done heinous shit.
oh man, this I'm going to tell you now. Smedley Butler's military career is basically a laundry list of all of the heinous shit that the U.S. did to other countries from basically like 1898 through 1933. All of the most evil shit that the U.S. did, Butler had a part in some way. So yeah, while he was in the Philippines, he fought a few battles against Filipino rebels. He had some like heroics. He did some heroic stuff. He dislodged like machine gun emplacements and like walked through fire to lead his men. That kind of stuff. I don't know if that counts as action hero stuff, but after that, he was sent to China, and this was where he really started to make a name for himself. Was in China. At the time, there was this pseudo religious secret society that Westerners were calling the Boxers, and they were revolting against both the Qing dynasty, the Chinese imperial government, and against like Western imperial powers who had carved out like bits and pieces of China to bring into like their respective spheres of influence. And this was called the Boxer Rebellion.
I think I've heard vaguely of the Boxer Rebellion.
Yeah, like for the past like 70 or so years, a whole bunch of different imperial powers from all across the world, mostly from Europe, but also like Russia and Japan, had just been um, carving off pieces of China to exploit for like cheap labor, cheap resources, cheap markets, stuff like that. And the Boxers were rising in revolt to try and kick them out. And so all of these different powers, including the US, Japan, Russia, Germany, Italy, Britain, France, just all of the big names of the time, they all sent their militaries there, just combined into one big army to go and put down this rebellion. Butler was a part of this. And that, like I said, this is where he starts to make a name for himself as a soldier of empire. During this campaign, twice in two different sieges of two different cities, he was shot while carrying a wounded comrade to safety.
Jesus.
Twice. The first time he was leading,
Does that count for 6 sips?
if you like.
Well, you said twice he got shot. That's some action movie shit. But you mentioned the same breath, so I'll count it as one.
Yeah, that works for me. But yeah, so the first time he was leading an assault through like 2,000 yards of flooded rice paddies. So all him and all of his Marines were up to their chests in water and were being fired on with like rifle shot and machine guns. And after about 1,500 yards, he realized there's no cover ahead of them, and so he orders a retreat. And then one of his Marines gets shot and is like struggling to keep his head above the water in the flooded rice paddy. And so he picks the guy up and throws him on his back and then carries him 1,500 yards through this entire flooded rice paddy with gunfire just blowing up all around him. Gets shot in the leg in the process, and brings the Marine back to safety.
Goodness gracious. My man was a fucking hero.
Yeah. And then the second time, I kind of think this one's a little bit crazier. So this is during the final battle. I think I think it was at the Battle of Peking, the Siege of Peking. The They were in a trench surrounding the city with a regiment of British soldiers. Butler and his Marines on one side of the trench, British soldiers on the other side. One of the one of the British troops is trying to get a beat on a boxer soldier who's firing on them from one of the city gates. And so he rushes out of the trench and he goes to try and fire on this guy, but then he gets shot in the chest and he falls down and he's wounded. And so Butler hops out of the trench and runs over, grabs the British soldier, and carries him back to the trench while he's under fire himself. Again, this is like 2 months after he was shot in the leg. So he brings this British guy back to the trench, throws him in, and then as he's climbing back down into the trench himself, he gets shot. Butler gets shot in the chest, and he falls back into the trench. And all of the other Marines are like, "Oh my God, our captain's dead," and they rush over to try and treat him, but he's not bleeding or anything. So they open up his shirt, and he's got a little graze, like a little scrape on his chest. And so then they look at his shirt and they realize that the bullet was stopped by the thick brass button on his pocket, on his breast pocket.
That's some what? That's some action movie shit for real. Because like, where else does a brass button save someone's life?
Yeah.
Sip.
There were a lot of people at the time who were talking about getting him a Medal of Honor for this stuff, but
Did he not?
he didn't because at the time officers couldn't get Medals of Honor.
Why not?
Um, I'm not entirely sure. I'm sure it has something to do because it was created with the idea of great giving awarding it for gallantry on the battlefield and in the mines at, at at the time, like during the Civil War when they first started giving out medals of honor. um, Officers didn't really get awards. I mean, they got awards, but they were career guys. They didn't need awards. They needed promotion. It was the privates and the corporals that got awards for stuff because they were the ones who were usually in the thick of the fighting, while the officers were kind of back behind, directing and leading, like they're supposed to be doing. Um, and so the idea of giving an award for gallantry like that to an officer was just kind of weird. It didn't really fit with what an officer was supposed to be in the military. And of course, by this point, that attitude had kind of changed because, as we've just seen, officers were very often in the thick of things just as much as their privates were.
Yeah.
Well, we're actually going to discuss like why they started giving officers the Medal of Honor, and it has something to do with Butler, and it's not good. But so instead of getting a medal or anything, he was given a brevet promotion to captain. So he was a first lieutenant. They promoted him to captain, and a brevet promotion means that uh, you get to skip all of like the interview process and all of like the paperwork and stuff that you need to be promoted. and you could just skip straight to the next rank. It doesn't come with like a boost in like you're. It's usually done on the battlefield, and it doesn't mean that you're going to be moved from like your posting or anything. It doesn't mean you're actually moving up in the ranks.
You're just ranking up. You're not actually going anywhere. You're not gonna.
Right. But it's still a big deal though, because it means you did some shit that they were like, okay, yeah, you've got a future, that kind of thing. And so by the time that he set foot on American soil again, he was being recognized by the Commandant of the Marine Corps and the Secretary of Navy, who both greeted him in person when he got back to the US. And he was 19 years old.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah. That was only 3 years. So he's back in the US. He's just posted at a bunch of different like naval stations around the US. Nothing big. In 1905, he married a woman named Ethel Conway Peters, and shortly after that, their marriage, they he gets moved and they get stationed in back in the Philippines garrison. And while they're in the Philippines, they have a daughter, Ethel Butler, who they named after her mother. A few years later, they're back in the U.S. in 1908, and he has a son, Smedley Jr. After that, okay, this is where we're gonna get into the wars that they don't teach you about in high school. So
Hit me. I love learning about the stuff that teachers didn't teach us about in school.
yeah, you might have heard the name, but you've definitely don't know anything about it. Have you ever heard of the Banana Wars?
No.
The Banana Wars. So in the 1900s, several Caribbean and Central American nations were revolting against their governments. These governments had been propped up by the US government in order to allow American businesses to try and buy up all of their land and use their populations as cheap labor so that they could grow crops like fruit and sugar for export to the US. One of the main things that they were growing besides sugar was bananas, which is where we get this name. Also, let me some of these countries that we're talking about, countries like Guatemala, Nicaragua, like 80%, 80 to 90% of all of the farmland in their country was owned by American corporations. Huge, like over half of the population of these countries were basically wage slaves. And in some cases, actual slaves on plantations owned by these American companies, like Standard Fruit Company. I can't remember what the other one was, but there were a couple. They have different names today, but they still exist. Chiquita and Dole. These are the companies we're talking about.
Lovely. I'm guessing that's Dole Fruit Company now.
Yeah, Dole Fruit Company. They were called some. They had different names back then, but their populations just mass poverty, had no access to their own land, had no access to the resources of their own country, couldn't couldn't develop like couldn't develop their communities because they couldn't they're the towns where they live literally couldn't afford to build buildings and stuff like that. Literally all of the country's finances, in some cases directly, were handled and directed uh, by these American corporations. And this was all made possible because of these very conservative governments that were propped up by the U.S. government in most of these countries. And so, in the mid to late 1900s, before 1910, um, a bunch of these countries just started revolting,
As they should.
and so they sent the best people for the job in to put down these rebellions. That was the United States Marine Corps.
That sounds like capitalism.
So Butler led Marines in campaigns against rebels in Panama, Honduras, Nicaragua. He was Here's the weird thing. He was a little bit older, he was wiser, he's a family man now. He was starting to look at the world a little bit more critically. And he saw exactly what was happening here.
I sure to God hope so.
They were destroying these countries' democracies for the interests of American businessmen. And that made him really uncomfortable.
As it should.
Yeah, as it should. But he still did it anyways because he's a Marine and a Marine does what he's told.
A Marine follows orders.
So yeah, there's like half a dozen different countries in Central America that he goes in over the course of 4 or 5 years. He goes and puts down these rebellions, helps rig elections, especially in Nicaragua. That was a big one. And so after the Banana Wars, Butler and his family ended up stationed at the Marine garrison at the Panama Canal. And while they were there, they had their second son, Thomas Richard Butler, in 1913. Do you remember what was going on around that area in Latin America in 1913?
Oh, was that the Mexican Revolution?
That was the Mexican Revolution. You remember what happened in 1914?
I suck at years, to be perfectly honest, Derek.
In 1914, Woodrow Wilson sent a naval force accompanied by Marines to attack and occupy the Mexican coastal city of Veracruz.
Okay.
He did that in order to help oust the military dictator at the time, Victoriano Huerta, so that they could install the revolutionary president Venustiano Carranza.
Ah, so this is when Carranza became the leader at the time.
Right. Yeah, this was during the constitutionalist revolt against Victoriano Huerta. And Butler was one of the Marines at Veracruz.
Damn.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is 1914. Uh, let's get something straight here, though. And this is going to be, I'm emphasizing this because this is important. He didn't do any heroic stuff at Veracruz. He basically all he did was he had a detachment of Marines. They went, they secured a few streets, they got in a couple firefights, they took out a few snipers, but nothing like big. He had like 9 wounded Marines and no deaths. It wasn't a huge thing. But the problem was the occupation of Veracruz was really, really unpopular in the US.
I wonder why.
Yeah, the specifically because Wilson had come to he had been elected president on a platform of keeping the United States out of a war.
And he inserted himself into another war.
Right, because at the time it looked like everybody could tell like see it from a million miles away. Um Europe was about to go into World War One was about to break up. Everybody saw the war on the horizon, and Americans were concerned about America being dragged, about the country getting dragged into a war in Europe. And so Wilson had promised, under my presidency, we are not going to get dragged into a war. And then one of the first things he does as president is sends Marines to occupy a city in a foreign country and get involved in that foreign country's civil war.
Sure, breathing some faith in your constituents, aren't you, Sir President?
Right. And so, what his administration decided to do so that they could spin it in the press is they started to emphasize the heroics of the Marines who fought at Veracruz and tell stories in the newspapers about their bravery under fire. And so, they started handing out medals and awards like candy. Specifically, they rescinded the policy of not awarding medals of honor to officers. Specifically, so they could award it to a few different officers who had fought at Veracruz, including Smedley Butler. And so, this is how Smedley Butler got the Medal of Honor, which he initially rejected because he knew full well he didn't deserve it for anything that he did at Veracruz, and he didn't feel justified accepting it. And so, he sent it back after he was given it. And then the Secretary of the Navy sent the medal back to him with a letter that basically said, if you don't accept this medal and you wear it on your dress uniform, you won't have a career in the Marine Corps after this. Also, I've mentioned several wars for business interests, and I didn't even notice.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, it feels like this whole thing was wars for business interest.
Yeah, that's why I made it the one sip rule.
Yeah, so let's do like 3 just for catch up.
Okay. Yeah, so that horse shit with the secretary, with the Navy, and with the Wilson administration is how he ended up getting his Medal of Honor, which he did not feel like he deserved.
I don't like accepting things I don't earn either, to be perfectly honest. Like, I hate trying like I also have really bad imposter syndrome. So sometimes I'll shut up and like if I don't feel like I earned something, I just assume it on that. But in his case, I probably would fight back and I would honestly I probably would take the sacking personally because I would rather that than wholly get something I know I didn't earn.
Yeah, but at this point, he was still pretty young. He was still like in his mid 20s, and he had a family by this point.
He's got to worry about his kids. I get it.
Yeah, he didn't have any other skills. He didn't know how to do anything else except be a marine at this point. So he a big part of it was just, well, regardless of what his feelings on what he's doing is, he's got to take care of his family now. So
Definitely. No, I can't blame him because of that on the family, to be perfectly honest now.
plus, I really have to emphasize he is militantly loyal to the Corps, to the Marine Corps. He loves the Corps more than life itself. He cannot fathom a life without being a Marine. It is the entirety of his being by this point.
I get it. I feel like loyalty to your job or to your organization was a lot easier back then because you didn't hear about their fuck ups as much. You didn't hear about everything because the internet didn't wasn't here yet. You couldn't know that hey, this thing happened, that thing happened, blah 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 blah.
Yeah, but the Marine Corps is still kind of the same way. I mean, there's a joke in the military that the Marines are kind of a cult.
I argue a lot of military people who are in it are cultish.
Oh yeah, like that's a pretty standard thing for like a lot of people in a lot of people in the military are fiercely loyal to their unit or to their service. But Marines are very unique in just how, like, not just how loyal they are to the Marine Corps, but the ways that they are. It's a very uh, it's it's something I don't really know how to describe. It's something you have to see when you interact with a Marine firsthand. At this point in his career, he is already he's closing in on about, oh, how old would he be at this point? 1915. So he's about 30 at this point, 29 or 30. Already has like a very well established reputation throughout the US military for how effective he is at fighting against insurgencies, especially after the Banana Wars. And so this time he was given an entire command of his own. He was given a bunch of Marines and he was told to go to Haiti. Now let's talk about what was going on in Haiti in 1950.
I was about to say, what the fuck are they doing in Haiti in that time?
Yeah, let's talk about what was going on in Haiti in 1915. They had they were having a little bit of political instability because just like in Central America, Haiti, the majority of their arable farmland was owned by sugar companies, and all of their literally the national bank of Haiti, the bank that holds like the government, uh, that manages the Haitian government's economy, is owned by a bank in New York.
What?
Yeah. Yeah, and that New York bank, it's called National City Bank of New York. They own all of the roads, the railroads, and the telegram wires in the entirety of the country. And so in 1915, Haiti had gone, understandably, like, just like in Central America, there's a lot of poverty in Haiti because of all of these facts. Butler is sent to Haiti, where so these revolts that Haiti has been having, they've gone through 5 presidents in about a year at this point.
God damn.
The revolving door of presidents that keep getting overthrown. A few of them have been like killed in the street. Um, it's making all of these American businessmen very nervous, and so they send in Butler and the Marines. And they they arrive in Haiti, and the first thing that they do is they have the Haitian National Assembly elect a new president, And literally, this is how it was described. It was while the National Assembly was in session in their Capitol building, there were just Marines with rifles like stationed like in every row of the seats where all of the delegates in the National Assembly were seated while they were voting. And they were given like, yeah, this is the guy, this is your list of guys that you could potentially vote for. This is the guy that the Americans would like you to vote for. You're not technically required to vote for them, but here's a Marine with a gun standing next to you in case you decide not to.
Oh, lovely.
And so they elect America's guy, and this guy has promised to keep Haiti open for American business. And so after this, naturally, the Haitian people are not very happy with this turn of events, and so a large portion of the country, especially in the northern part of the country, go into revolt. This is called the Keiko Rebellion, is what it's called. And this rebellion is put down by Butler and his Marines. They go through the jungle, they clear out a bunch of encampments, and they force the rebels back into this one fortress, this old French fortress from back when it was a French colony. And they're held up in this fortress. There's like 800 rebels, and Butler has like 30 Marines. And so they can't, obviously they're not going to assault this fortress head on. They're never going to be able to do that. So what they do instead is Butler finds a storm grate or like a drainage tube, a drainage pipe, and that is big enough to hold a man. And so in the middle of the night, he and all of these like this 20 like 28 26 28 Marines, they sneak through this pipe and they emerge on the other side inside of the fortress. And then when they get there, they just start firing and they start making as much noise as possible to trick all of the rebels inside into thinking that it's a larger force than it actually is. And so all of the rebels immediately like think that they're already overrun. And so they start running and they abandon the fort. One Marine is wounded and they kill 300 rebels.
Jesus fucking Christ, that's stupid.
It was a bloodbath. Um, After this action, the deputy, or I'm sorry, the undersecretary of the Navy at the time comes down to Haiti and meets with Butler, and they go through the fort, and he explains to the undersecretary all of like the this action and how he dislodged and how he pushed the rebels out of the fort and how they were able to clean up the last of the rebel forces after that. So that was like the death blow to the Keiko Rebellion. And the undersecretary is so impressed that he recommends Smedley Butler to Congress for a second Medal of Honor, and he receives it.
How did Smedley feel about the second one?
He accepted this one gladly. He thought he actually earned this one.
I think it's kind of shitty situation, but American politics, they wouldn't view it as that.
And so after that, Butler and that undersecretary of the Navy actually become pretty good friends, and they keep correspondence with one another. Um, do you know who that guy was? The undersecretary of the Navy?
Nope.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Damn.
Yep, future president of the United States, who's going to play a very big part in this story coming up. But this is how they first meet and become acquainted.
Oh, goodness.
So after putting down the Keiko Rebellion, Butler he's promoted to colonel. So now he's a colonel at this point. He's like 30, so, which is insanely young to be a colonel, by the way. Um, he is actually he is put in command of the Haitian National Gendarmes, which is basically like the national military police force. And shortly after that, the trying National Assembly, of course, is frustrated by the fact that their country is now controlled by Americans, and so they tried to call a vote of no confidence to try and oust the puppet president of Haiti that is seated at that Butler helped bring to power. And so the Haitian president goes to Butler and asks him to use the gendarmes to forcibly disband the National Assembly.
Quick derailment related to our rules. I just looked at something. When you mentioned the bank that controls Haiti, wouldn't that be a rich asshole?
If you like.
Shot, post dated shot time.
Prost.
Come by.
So yeah, the president comes to Butler and asks him to forcibly disband the National Assembly using this police force, and he does it. He literally marches all of these Haitian cops to the National Assembly, kicks all of them out of the building, and shuts down the doors, and like locks up the doors and puts the entire building under armed guard. And now, literally, the only government left in Haiti is the president, who is under the thumb of Smedley Butler because he's the one who has the Marines and all of the cops. And so Smedley Butler is now essentially the military dictator of Haiti.
What the fuck?
It's fucking insane.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
He just established a puppet government with him in charge, essentially, for a little bit.
Yes. Yes, it's fucking wild. It is horrific. It's awful. The next part is even worse. If for Jeff, if for some reason you're listening to this, I'm so fucking sorry for what our country did to yours. This is not acceptable. Um, so when once he's in power, once he has basically absolute power over Haiti, um, he starts this program where he's using he's using native Haitian labor to start building roads and rail lines and telegraph wires, hugely expands the infrastructure of the country. Um, and along with that, is building like schools and hospitals and things like that. And a lot of people have kind of presented this as like a very noble thing that he did. That like it was proof that like he actually cared very deeply about the Haitian people.
Yeah, fucking right.
And in his letters he claims that he has a very high respect and regard for the Haitian people, and he hates what the United States is doing to this country, that he specifically is doing to this country. But this building program that he's set up, it doesn't use paid labor. So basically, what's happening is he's sending out U.S. Marines and native Haitian gendarmes, and basically just rounding up a bunch of random people and forcing them into unpaid labor to build all of these projects.
God damn.
By the time that he's done, by the time that he leaves Haiti, um, thousands of Haitians have died from overwork during from this program.
So Smedley Butler's a piece of shit.
He is a piece of shit, which is going to make the second part of the story so much more wild. But yeah, yeah. Also keep right, and so also keep in mind all of this infrastructure that he's building is private property owned by National City Bank, that New York bank.
Is it? It's still a bank, right? You said that, right?
It does not exist anymore. No,
Okay. I was about to say fuck National City Bank, but whatever it was.
it might actually. Wait. Hold on. I've got to look this up real quick. It might be Citibank. Now that I think about it.
Reasons why not to use Citibank if it is.
Yep. Now it's Citibank.
Fuck Citibank. None of us should use it.
Oh my god. Oh my. This is even. Um.
You didn't realize?
I had looked it up before, like when I was first doing this research, and the only National City Bank I could find was National City Bank of Cleveland, which went out of business in 2008.
Jeez.
But Then during when I was reading the other book, it mentioned National City Bank of New York, but I hadn't gone and double checked that, and I just did, and it is Citibank today. Oh my god. Oh.
Do you use them or something? Is that why you're so distraught?
Oh no. No, I am a loyal credit union user.
Okay, fuck Citibank.
I'm a loyal credit union customer, so yeah. So also this system that he's this basically like slave labor system he sets up.
It's not basically. It's not basically. It is.
Yeah, slave labor system that he set up. After he leaves, it would continue. The U.S. occupation of Haiti would continue long after he was there, well into the 20s, I'm pretty sure. And it was hugely enlarged after he left by successive um, administrations. And by the end of the American occupation of Haiti, hundreds of thousands of Haitian citizens were killed by it.
Does not surprise me with America's history.
Yeah, it's a fucking nightmare. Also, I there's so many fucking wars in this. While he was in Haiti, while he was effectively the military dictator in Haiti, there was another attempted revolution in the Dominican Republic, which is the country that's just next door to Haiti on the island of Hispaniola. And so he took a bunch of Marines and just hopped over next door for a couple months, put down that rebellion, and then came back to Haiti.
He sounds like he was the military's favorite child.
Yeah, he was. This is the way that I've heard it put is that he is the most effective soldier of empire that the United States has ever had,
Sounds like it.
which is 100% like, yeah, he is an expert at fighting insurgencies. He is an expert at enforcing military dominance over an oppressed country. And I know I keep referencing it. I'm not going to get into it because I'm trying to explain his entire arc, the entire arc of his life before we get into like the big stuff at the end. This background makes what comes later in his life so it makes it more compelling, but
Mind boggling.
more mind-boggling, but also more compelling. But we'll get into that. So, despite all of the subjectively evil stuff that he was doing in Haiti, and I want to make it clear, I'm not going to whitewash his actions at all. I think we've made it pretty clear. This is a fucking evil thing that he's done. But even as he's doing all of this stuff, he was still like writing letters to anybody in the military and anybody in the federal government who would listen to him, begging them to stop the occupation of Haiti and order him and his Marines recalled from Haiti. And then after a few months of that, he realized he was being ignored. And so he started sending letters begging to be transferred out of his position.
God damn. Basically, he was like, I refuse not to follow orders, but I fucking hate my orders.
I will follow your orders, but I'm also begging you to give me different orders. Yeah. So he kept yeah. Yeah. So he ended up being ignored, obviously. So he just kept up his this police state he had going like a good little Marine. So he stays in Haiti until 1917. In mid 1917, the US entered the First World War. And Butler was now finally transferred out of Haiti, and he was sent to run the training facility at the newly constructed Marine barracks at Quantico, Virginia, which at this time, the Marine barracks at Quantico were literally the only buildings there because it was a shithole swamp in the middle of nowhere.
Doesn't surprise me.
So So yeah, he's you know about Quantico, right? It's the
You're talking to the guy who wanted to be FBI.
right, yeah. Yeah. So Smedley Butler's basically the guy who founded Quantico.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So and then he stays there. He's training Marines for a little bit. A few months later, he's finally put on a ship and he's sent to France. And he is
Why the fuck was he in France?
because it's World War One.
Oh shit. I forgot. This is all in the background of World War One.
Yeah, like this is just right after the U.S. enters World War One in 1917, and that's why they built the Marine barracks at Quantico. Is because they were trying to expand the Marine Corps to such a large extent that they needed more training facilities, and so they Quantico was one of the new areas that they developed for that. Um, so he ends up in France, and he is super fucking excited. He's finally being able to fight a proper war, not just putting down an insurgency, destroying democracies. He's finally gonna get to serve his country in a good, proper way, in a proper war. And then he gets there and he gets some good news and he gets some bad news. The good news is he's being promoted to brigadier general, which is the lowest general. It's a 1-star general.
What's the bad news?
The bad news is he's not going to see any action.
I bet that pissed him off.
Oh, he was extremely disappointed. I should mention, he is to this day, still to this day, he's the youngest Marine to ever hold the rank of general in the entire history of the Marine Corps.
Holy shit.
He was 37. It's wild. It's crazy. And so, but yeah, the reason that he's not going to see any action is because uh, General John Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, knows about his record in Haiti and realizes that, oh, he's already run an entire country. We have a personnel processing camp in the city of Brest, which is on the uh, western coast of France, and so they've got this camp, and it's basically processing all of the American personnel that are coming in and going out of France. It's the way station where it's the choke point where all of the U.S. military's logistics and infrastructure is coming through. And it at that point, it's a complete nightmare. It's a complete mess. Um, and they need somebody who's really good at administration to go and run it so that they can increase its efficiency and take care of all of the troops that are because it's bringing in American troops who are being processed before they can get sent to the front and organizing units that are incoming from the U.S. And it's also holding a bunch of wounded soldiers who are just coming back from the trenches and they're waiting to be put on ships to be taken back to the U.S. And they're all basically living in tents without floors and sleeping in mud and shit like that. And so they need somebody who's a good administrator to go and run it to make it work better. And Smedley Butler, the guy who's just run the entire country of Haiti for 2 years, is easily the best administrator in the entire U.S. military. And so that's why he's given this job. This is September of 1917. Or I'm sorry, this is September of 1918. Yeah. The war ends 2 months later, November 11th, 1918. And here's some crazy shit. In those 2 months that he's running this camp in the city of Brest, he apparently he does an amazing job. He does a mind-bogglingly good job of running this camp. Everybody agreed. Like every sheet of paperwork was in order. Every troop got to where they were going on time. When the war ended, all of the American troops were withdrawn, and all like 250,000 or so American personnel that were in France all passed through this camp on their way back to France or on their way back from France to the US. And they all saw just how efficiently and how effectively it was run. And the army, because this was an army installation, they were so it was apparently such a beneficial, like having this camp run so well was apparently so beneficial to the war effort that the army gave him a distinguished service cross, which is the second most prestigious award that the military awards, right under the Medal of Honor. And so he got a Distinguished Service Cross from the Army, which was not even the branch that he was in, for running a camp. It's kind of wild. And then this is an even more wild part. His own department, which was the Department of Navy, they were embarrassed by the fact that one of their guys was being given this prestigious award by the Army while they weren't giving him anything. And so the Navy also awarded him a Distinguished Service Cross.
That's just all I have to say to that is just sigh. To be honest,
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier when I mentioned that he got his second Medal of Honor in Haiti. He Smedley Butler is one of four servicemen in the entire history of the U.S. military to ever receive two medals of honor.
you did not.
Yeah, one of four ever.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, this next part I included it because I thought it was cool, or I thought it was interesting. So after World War I ends, he goes back and he's put in charge of the training facility at Quantico. And while he's in Quantico, he helps set up and found the Marine Corps' football team.
Well, okay, that feels left field.
Yeah, did you know the Marine Corps used to have actually multiple football teams? Like each different bases and different units would have their own football teams. And he helped set up the Marine Corps' first football team, the Quantico Marines Devil Dogs. And they weren't just like a little like hobby thing, like yeah, we go play in the park sometimes. They played in the NCAA.
Oh Jesus! So it was like a big.
Yeah, they played NCAA Division 1. Like they had regular seasonal games against Michigan, the University of Michigan. I want you to guess when the Marine Corps got rid of their football team. What was the last season that they played?
Probably ridiculously recent compared to what we think. So I'm going to say 80s or 90s.
Ooh, overestimated a little bit. 1972. Yeah, their this football team, their main rival was the football team for the U.S. Army Ninth Armored Division. That was like their season, their annual rivalry, big rivalry game was against their football team. The first head coach for the Ninth Armored Division's football team was Dwight Eisenhower,
Oh Jesus!
who went on to become a president.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm gonna give you their when 1972. This was their record. Uh, when the team was disbanded, this was their final record. They had 339 wins, 134 losses, 15 ties. They had four national service titles, which were special national titles that were given to all of the different military football teams that played against one another. Whoever that each year they'd have their own sort of national championship title, and they had four of those. And they had one head coach who would go on to receive the Medal of Honor.
Jesus.
Yeah, this guy, this guy who was it was their third or fourth head coach in the mid 1930s, and he would go on to be killed in action at Guadalcanal, the Battle of Guadalcanal in World War II, and he would receive the Medal of Honor.
I've never heard of that battle.
Guadalcanal? That's the most famous battle associated with the Marine Corps.
Again, I've never heard it.
Yeah, I might talk about it sometime. It was in the Pacific. It was a, um I forgot what the island is. It's an island in like the Indonesian island chain um north of Australia. They were fighting the Japanese. Anyways, in 1923, Butler. This is a weird story. This kind of came out of left field. He took a break from the Marine Corps for a couple years, and he didn't do it like he didn't want to. He was basically ordered to by the president.
What do you? Why was he ordered to take a couple years out?
because he had been offered a job by the mayor of Philadelphia.
Okay.
The president at the time was um, Harding. Yeah, it was Harding, who was a Republican, and the mayor of Philadelphia had a lot of sway within the Republican Party, and was able to get in uh, Harding's ear. And so at the time, prohibition had just been put into place. The constitutional amendment outlawed the sale and consumption of alcohol, all of that stuff. There was a bunch of organized crime all over the country. The mobs were getting rich. There were speakeasies. There were gambling, illicit gambling halls. Everybody who was from the poorest of the poor to the richest of the rich were making money off of illicit bootleg liquor, and it was especially a bad problem in a lot of like East Coast and Midwestern cities. Like Chicago's, of course, a big one. New York was a big one, but Philadelphia was also suffering from a lot of organized crime. And so the mayor of Philadelphia asked Smedley Butler to come to Philadelphia and take the position as director of public safety, which would put him in charge of all of the police in Philadelphia, and to use his military experience to clear out all of the organized crime in the city.
What in the world?
Yeah, it's wild. It came out of left field, and he didn't want to do it because he's a Marine. He is there to do Marine stuff. This is not his area. But they 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 pointed out that he had already had experience as a cop in Haiti.
You mean when he was a fucking dictator?
Yeah, when he was a fucking dictator. But dictators are just like, is what happens when you mix a cop with a politician. You get a dictator. That's
You're not wrong.
so. Yeah, he was basically strong armed into doing this by the Hoover administration. He spends 2 years in Philadelphia. He does an insanely good job. It becomes almost impossible to run bootleg liquor in the city. The problem was that he didn't just target like poor people who were drinking and selling booze. He targeted the rich people too,
And that probably pissed him off, didn't it?
and it pissed them off a lot. And so they kept putting political pressure on the mayor of Philadelphia until eventually he was forced to fire Smedley, even though he's doing such a good job. And so Smedley, 2 years later, he goes back to the Marine Corps. So goes back to Quantico, goes back to his regular training duties. Eventually, he ends up getting deployed one last time, and that's in 1927. And what's interesting is he goes back more or less to where his career basically started, not to Cuba, but to the big one, China. At the time, China was in the midst of this crazy, complicated civil war. There had been a revolution in the early 1920s in China. It had overthrown the Qing dynasty, and it had instituted like a constitutional republic. And then 4 years later, when the president of that constitutional republic died, the entire country fell apart into these different areas that were all controlled by like different warlords who ruled all of their respective areas with an iron fist. And one of these areas in southern China was controlled by a political party. Its proper name is the Guomindang. That's how it's pronounced, or more or less how it's pronounced in Chinese. In English, they like to pronounce it Kuomintang, but it's Guomindang. And the Guomindang, they're a nationalist party. They want to establish like a constitutional republic and reunite China and kick out all of the imperialist powers. That's their thing. Um, the leader of the Guomindang dies in like 1925. This guy named Sun Yat Sen, who's still revered in China today, is like the father of modern China, and he is succeeded by this much more conservative military leader named Chiang Kai Shek. And Chiang Kai Shek comes is coming very close to reunifying China. He has already reunified all of southern China, and now he's launching a northern expedition to go and try and capture Beijing. Um, the reason that the Americans are concerned is because Shanghai is very close to where all the fighting has happening. And Shanghai it's an international city. It has an international status. It's home to delegations from, you remember all of those like foreign colonial powers that I told you about before.
Yeah.
This is Shanghai is one of the main areas where all of these like different colonial business interests are set up shop. And this area is where a lot of the fighting is happening between these northern warlords and the southern nationalist force. These southern nationalists are trying to kick these colonial powers out of China, and so they're concerned that Shanghai is going to be threatened by these nationalist forces, and so they send General Butler and a bunch of Marines to go and defend American citizens and American property within Shanghai.
How did that work out for us?
It actually went fine because he went into it. He had no interest. By this point, he's very disillusioned.
I certainly to God hope so.
Yeah. Yeah, he's very disillusioned with the entire defending or fighting wars for American business, that whole thing. And so when he shows up, he's like, fuck your property. I'll protect your lives. And that's it. And so he's able to do a lot of negotiations and diplomacy with some of the local nationalist forces. And um, he's able to protect the lives and even, most of the property of the American businesses that operated there, and especially Standard Oil, who actually gave him a letter of thanks for defending all of their oil rigs that they had going in that area, which deeply upset him to get that letter.
I bet.
So yeah, he's there for about a year. Yeah, a year and a half, I think. He gets back in 1929, and he's shortly after he gets back home, he is promoted to major general. Once again, the youngest Marine in the entire history of the Corps to hold the rank. And remember, this is 1929. Do you know what happened that year in the United States?
No, not really.
In October 1929, the Dow Jones on the New York Stock Exchange dropped by 69 points, or about 25%, in just 2 days.
Was that the depression?
Mm-hmm. There were rushes on banks. Hundreds of businesses went into the red over in the blink of an eye, and billions of dollars in investment were wiped out overnight. In the coming months, millions of Americans would be out of jobs, and economic growth in the country would grind to a standstill. And that was the start of the Great Depression. And it was a turning point for Smedley Butler, because in the aftermath, in the months following the start of the Depression, he saw some of the people that were hardest hit and most affected were veterans. They're poor veterans, guys who had come home from some of the wars that he had fought in. Most of them were from the trenches in France, who didn't have any skills beyond fighting and killing when they got home, who had seen the worst that humanity could create, the both the disturbing, insane, apocalyptic horror of the trenches of World War One, and had just had to come home. And you could never expect somebody to function like that. And so when the poverty and the homelessness and the unemployment of the Great Depression hit, veterans were especially hit hard. And Butler had this realization that he couldn't fight these for the people who had caused this anymore, because he recognized,
He finally had his awakening saying, oh, this shit's fucked.
yeah, he's finally connecting the dots, and he realized everything that I was doing in in Cuba, China, the Philippines, Nicaragua, Honduras, Panama, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, all these places, The people that were doing all of these heinous things that I did for them, they caused this. It's all coming home. Their greed destroyed democracies across the planet. And I helped them do it. And a lot of these men helped them do it as well. And now they're back home. And now our country's being destroyed by these people. And the people who served this country so well and so effectively are now being left out, and their families being left to starve and die out in the cold.
It's because the government gives no shits about you.
Yes. Yeah, and this is, oh my god, it comes up so many times when you're reading about American military history. And then the veterans got fucked over again. The veterans went, they did some bad stuff, they came home, they got screwed over. It keeps happening over and over.
It happens over and over and over again.
Yeah. And so Butler, keep in mind, still active duty, still a general in the US military. He started his career as an activist, an anti-war activist.
Damn, that's big steps for my man.
He began speaking to veterans organizations, especially the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW, giving speeches about how greed from big business and Wall Street had caused the suffering of the Depression, and of course, tying it back to all of these wars that he'd helped fight in all of these far-flung areas, corners of the world. And he especially focused on how, if they weren't careful, business interests were going to destroy American democracy, just as it had the democracies of all of these other countries.
If only it happened sooner.
During one of these speeches, this is a weird story, but bear with me. During one of these speeches, he criticized the authoritarianism of the government in Italy, which was the fascist government of Italy under Benito Mussolini, which had risen to power in 1922 after a coup d'état. This famous thing, Mussolini and his National Fascist Party had this paramilitary wing called the Black Shirts, or the RDT, and they
I'm assuming it's their version of the brown coats or whatever it was.
yeah they had the Italy had the black shirts, Germany had the brown shirts. Actually, the United States had their own version. It's called the Silver Shirts.
Honestly, does that surprise me much? Nope.
Yeah, it was a party called the Christian Party.
Why am I not surprised that religion was also a part of the.
Yeah, it was started by this failed screenwriter from California named William Dudley Pelley. He'd been like a very conservative Protestant Christian, but he also got into uh like spiritualism and esotericism, and he kind of combined them into like this racial idea. It was the same sort of like racial ideology that the Nazis came up with, like this idea of like the Aryan race. He kind of had the same. He was kind of doing the same thing, but he was combining it with like American Protestantism, and created like this his own little fascist party with paramilitary that he called the Brown Shirts, or I mean the Silver Shirt, or they were called the Silver Shirts. His name for them was the Silver Legion, and the complete dorks. They never accomplished anything. They lost a bunch of elections. Got into a few street fights that they lost with cops, and then when U.S. entered World War II, uh, they they all got repressed by the. They were forced to disband their party, and they were all forced like into quiet obscurity. The biggest big fucking losers, but yeah, they were there anyways.
I mean, they seem like losers, not gonna lie.
Yeah, yeah. What we're about to talk about, they were this version. These were much more effective fascist, even though they were also insanely incompetent. But we'll get into it.
Isn't that the weird dichotomy that they can be incompetent but competent, like effective at the same time?
Yeah, they're effective at just the right things, and then they're incompetent at everything else. Like they know how to gain power and how to wield power. They just don't know what the fuck they're doing in any other aspect of their lives. That's what a fascist is.
Sounds about right.
So yeah, During one of his speeches, he criticized Benito Mussolini, and the statement ended up being leaked to the press. It was supposed to be like a private speech that he gave to, I think it was in New Jersey or somewhere, just a VFW. And when it got out to the press, it caused an international incident, and Mussolini was demanding an apology from the U.S. government.
And how did the U.S. government reply?
Um, they were like, yeah, they went along with it. Um, but Smedley Butler became the very first general in the U.S. military to be court-martialed since the Civil War.
Holy schnit! I didn't realize there had been that big of a gap.
Yeah, there'd been lots of court-martials, but never for a general during that period. Like court-martials are just daily thing. Like a grunt gets caught, like a private gets caught drunk driving, they're going to end up court-martialed or something.
Well, no duh.
But for a general, this was insanely rare. It was a huge deal. And but the thing is, though, he was court-martialed, but he never actually made it to court. He never actually got to the court part of the court-martial
How come?
because by this point, Butler was the most popular officer in the entire U.S. military, both amongst veterans because of all of his veteran activism work, and because a whole bunch of them remember him from that camp in France. And so every single person in the veterans community in the United States knows and loves Smedley Butler. And there was an enormous outcry from all across the country. Everybody was set, like, the way that it looked to the American public was that they are persecuting this patriotic war hero because he spoke out against an authoritarian anti-democratic dictator. And there was such a huge backlash against the the federal government for authorizing this court martial that they ended up quietly dropping the charges because they couldn't handle the public backlash. But it's it's kind of been building up by this point. But by now, Butler is on the U.S. military and the federal government shit list. They don't like him. They want him out, no matter how effective a serviceman he actually is, how effective a Marine he actually is. And even though they couldn't court martial him, they still got back at him.
How so?
So when the previous commandant of the Marine Corps retired, Butler was the highest ranking Marine in the service. He was the highest ranking Marine in the entire Marine Corps when that the previous commandant went out. And on top of that, he had an impeccable record. He had 2 Medals of Honor. He had awards from 3 or 4 different countries by this point. Um, Everybody knew exactly what his record was and how effective he was as a soldier, as a leader, as an administrator, all the important stuff you need to be a leader of the Marine Corps. He was a shoo-in. It would be stupid not to make him the commandant. And so they went with the other guy, whose name I
So really, just kind of telegraph that they just didn't like him because of that, right?
and so that was finally too much for him. At this point, he wasn't even being allowed to serve the Marine Corps to the best of his ability in the best way that he could because of the politics. And so Major General Smedley Butler retired from the Marine Corps on October 1st, 1931. He was 50 years old and he had been in the Marine Corps for 33 years and 4 months. But his life wasn't quite over yet. He had a little ways to go. And in fact, probably the most important moment of his story is just about to come. So let's rewind real quick. We're 1931 at this point. Let's go back to 1917.
Why are we going back?
The United States entered the First World War in 1917 on the side of the Triple Entente, the alliance between France, the UK, and Russia. Back then, up to this point, World War One, the US didn't have a standing army. Previous to this period, they had relied on state volunteer regiments. So individual states would raise their own regiments of volunteers during times of war who'd be briefly trained and then deployed wherever it was that the army needed them. But a war on the scale that they were talking about in World War One, it needed more centralization, it needed better formations, it needed better training, and it needed more coordinated troops. It needed a more professional military. And most of all, this new army had to be big, like bigger than anything the US had seen since the Civil War. And so, in order to recruit troops in the numbers that they needed, they had to make enlisting more enticing.
And how did you do that?
One of the ways they did that was, well, something they still do today. They offered an enlistment bonus, and this bonus, the specific bonus they were offering back then, uh, would be in the form of a lump sum of cash, which would be placed in a savings bond, which would accrue interest at a fixed rate that the soldiers or their next of kin would be able to draw on in 25 years, or 1942. Fast forward, it is 1932. The Great Depression is at its deepest and most devastating point. Millions of veterans of the war and their families were now unemployed, homeless, impoverished, and they were talking and they decided that under the circumstances they think that it would be appropriate for the federal government to go ahead and cash out those bonuses early in order to relieve their poverty. They argued that considering their service and their sacrifice on behalf of Uncle Sam, that they should go ahead and get that money, which really they had already earned and they desperately needed at that time, which, to me seems like a perfectly reasonable request.
Mm-hmm. Government wouldn't do it.
There was a bill that was brought to Congress. It had passed the House, but then when it went to the Senate, it was shot down that year, 1932. And so, in response to that, 20,000 veterans and their families from across the country traveled to Washington, D.C., and they set up a shantytown camp outside of the Capitol building, just a protest camp, an occupying camp. And they occupied the grounds until they received their bonus. They promised to occupy these grounds until they received their bonus. And this group of vets, it came to be called the Bonus Army.
I have heard of the bonus army. It sounded super familiar, but I wasn't sure if this was the only time that it happened or not. So I was waiting for you to say if it was or not.
Yeah, this is the Bonus Army. So after retiring from the Marine Corps, Smedley Butler went on speaking tours across the country. He went full hog into this activism stuff he had started doing. He went on speaking tours across the country. He was speaking out against foreign intervention, militarism, the threat of big business and Wall Street, the threat that it posed to American democracy, and especially, of course, the plight of unemployed veterans. It just everywhere. He was giving thousands of speeches a year. It was crazy how active this guy was. In the summer of 1932, he was invited to join the bonus marchers and go speak to the bonus army, give a speech. And so he came, he publicly gave his support for the bonus. And during his speech, he gave basic stuff. He talked about the greed of Wall Street and the bankers, the greed of the government who refused to give the veterans what they were owed. He also told them, keep their chins up, ignore the papers, because at this time the newspapers were accusing them all of being like communist agitators and stuff like that.
Of course they were.
Of course they were. Yeah, you get any group of poor people together large enough, and the newspapers are going to start screaming about Bolshevism.
Of course.
And so he ended his speech by reminding them to, remain peaceful, remain lawful, don't riot or become violent. It will only hurt your cause, that kind of thing. And after that, he spent the night in the camp. He slept with them. He ate dinner alongside these men, many of whom had actually served under him in the Marine Corps. And like I said, a lot of them had also passed through his camp in France. And they knew who he was and the reputation he had for defending the enlisted guys. And the bonus army, they heeded his advice. They were getting periodically harassed by police, Like some cops would come and just start roughing some guys up, and there were a few fights and stuff. But all in all, 200,000 veterans who are atypically, especially veterans of World War One, the trenches of France. All of them, or a good portion of them, probably had like some crazy bad post traumatic stress.
Obviously.
Yeah, poor veterans are like combat veterans and poverty are usually like a nightmarish mix. But and you've got 20,000 of them all gathered here. But despite that, they were shockingly peaceful. They weren't fighting. They didn't come armed. They didn't bring guns or clubs or anything. They weren't here to bust heads or to overthrow the government or anything. They were just there to sit on government property until they got the bonus that they were owed. And that was it. But for anyone familiar with American history, you will know that a protest being peaceful has never stopped the hammer from falling.
Nope, never.
On July 28th, 1932, just a couple days after Butler was there, President Herbert Hoover ordered the protest camp to be dispersed, and he sent in the army. The force that was sent in to break up the protest was commanded by the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Douglas MacArthur. And he was joined by two of his subordinates, George S. Patton and Dwight Eisenhower.
Jesus Christ.
You recognize all three of those names, don't you?
Um, yes, but MacArthur, I can't remember where from.
Um, all three of those men are today revered as heroes of the Second World War. They were three of the most effective commanders we had in fighting fascism, fighting against the Nazis and against the Japanese during the Second World War. And also, Eisenhower would go on, of course, to become president after the war. And this is what they're getting up to during the Great Depression: is marching into a protest camp full of World War One veterans armed with bayonets, cavalry. They had 6 tanks. They swept through and they burnt down the shanty town. Several veterans, about like 10 or 15 veterans, were killed in the process.
Jesus.
And so Butler, Smedley Butler, he was a lifelong Republican. Herbert Hoover was a Republican, but you know, party loyalty isn't. It was a more flexible thing back then than it is now.
Yeah, I feel like nowadays more people are on their side and they're not going to switch nowadays.
Yeah, yeah. It's nowadays if this happened, if a Democrat does it, then all the Democrats will find a way to explain how it's good, and Republicans will be outraged. And if a Republican does it, all of the Democrats will be outraged, but all the Republicans will be explaining how it's good, that kind of thing. But yeah, but so Butler, who was a lifelong Republican, he was so outraged by Hoover's order to break up the protest that he immediately began campaigning for the Democratic presidential nominee. The Democratic presidential nominee was at that time the governor of New York. And not only was he running on a platform of economic reform and jobs programs that Butler very much supported, but the nominee was also an old friend of his, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So by this point, because of the Depression and because of the Republicans' insane lack of response to the Depression, Hoover's approval rating was already in the toilet, and the crackdown on the bonus marchers dropped it even lower, and was more or less the final nail in the coffin for the Republican campaign in 1936. And so, or I'm sorry, 1932, yeah. And so FDR entered the Oval Office in 1933. Within 100 days of entering office, FDR's new reforms, which came to be called the New Deal, were in full swing. Now let's. Oh, this is where it gets spicy. Let's talk about the New Deal.
Good old New Deal that got neutered from everything I've ever been told.
Yeah, the New Deal. Literally, the United States was on life support, economically, socially, politically. It was on life support, and it could have had the it the US should have by all rights fallen apart. It was the New Deal that brought it back from the brink of total annihilation and built it up into a position where it would be able to face on two of the most powerful militaries on the planet at the same time. Japan and Germany play a large part in their destruction. It all started with the New Deal. It's insane. It's wild. It is still, even as as much as I as much history as I've read and studied, and as much as I try to know about history, there is nothing that is as wild to me as mind-bogglingly bizarre as how close the United States came to just ceasing to exist.
I'm kind of wouldn't be surprised if it's happened a bajillion times.
Yeah, but yeah, let's talk about the New Deal for a second. So the reaction to the New Deal across the country was immediate. Working class people, unemployed people, you know, salt of the earth, be guys like you and me. They all cheered for the New Deal. They cheered for the federal jobs programs. They cheered for the public works programs, the union protections, the minimum wage, the social security, all of that good stuff. To the business class, the industrialists, Wall Street, bankers, that group of guys,
They hated it.
the New Deal was a disaster. To them, the New Deal was nothing less than the first step to a communist takeover, to Bolshevism destroying the nation from the inside and letting the rabble and the poor reign through mob rule. That kind of horse shit. And so all these guys, they started looking for ways to fight back against this obvious red menace that was threatening American values, and of course, more importantly, threatening their own bottom lines. It's the most important part. And so they were looking over at Europe, what was going on in Europe in the 1930s, where some exciting, innovative new ideas were coming to power in some of these countries. These movements were explicitly anti communist, anti union, very friendly to business interests. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's National Fascist Party had been in power for over a decade by that point, and their effective neutering of leftism in the country was very promising. They were very, they liked that a lot. They thought that was really good stuff that Mussolini was doing over there.
Does that surprise me? Not at all.
Not at all, no. At the same year, 1933, in Germany, the National Socialist German Workers' Party had won a majority in the German Reichstag, and their leader, Adolf Hitler, had been appointed chancellor. And Hitler was promising to uproot the evils of Jewish Bolshevism from the country and to provide a safe home for industry and a rejuvenated German economy. In these countries, American businessmen couldn't help but notice that the rise of fascism was made possible by the support of paramilitary organizations like the black shirts, the brown shirts, guys like that. A lot of these organizations were largely composed of veterans of the Great War. They were veterans organizations. And so the gears were starting to turn in the brains of America's wealthy classes. They were starting to look for options on how to get rid of this whole New Deal nonsense. On July 1st, 1933, a limousine pulled up to Smedley Butler's home in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. Inside the limousine were two obviously wealthy men who urgently needed to speak to the retired Marine on a matter of great importance. One of these men was named Bill Doyle. Doyle was the commander of the Massachusetts American Legion, and he was joined by his partner, a guy named Gerald McGuire, who was a former commander of the Connecticut American Legion. And you wanna explain like what our little bit of history with the American Legion is?
We went to Boy State together the same year. That's actually how we first met before we really knew we met.
Yeah, yeah, and American and the
The American Legion puts on this like mock government. That's what Boy State is. Every summer for juniors who are going into their senior year of summer, at least here in Oklahoma. I don't know if the rules are exactly the same across state to state, but we just simulated government. It's like a week long camp of a simulated government, basically.
Yeah, but there's also like a whole military thing. Like each of the cities that like each like all the boys are separated into like these groups. They're kind of run like cities. Like they'll have their own mayors and their own like city like municipal positions and their leadership and all that. But these cities will uh march from event to event. Like if they're going to meals, they'll form up in like a
I really only saw that part the militaristic part was simply because it was hosted by the Legion, not because it was inherently militaristic itself. It was just how they controlled the boys because they're boys. It's just
well, I
you know.
I don't know. To me, it like looking back on it, it kind of like it kind of hints at like the sort of ideology of the American Legion. I feel like they it seems completely natural to these to all of the guys in the Legion who are running Boy State. It that seemed like a completely natural like continuation because or a natural connection because they associate government so much with the military. And I think that and I don't know, do you did you ever get that impression that like they have a very strong association between like their ideal way that the US government should be run and the role that like the military would play in it? That kind of I don't know if I am I even making sense?
I get what you're getting at. I wasn't thinking that deep at the time, so I don't remember enough to say yes or no.
Yeah, but yeah, I will say from my perspective, like looking back on Boy State and like a week just basically just living with the Legion. Um, there's a lot of there's a lot of ideology going on there. Let's just say
Definitely.
the American Legion definitely has an ideology, and I think it makes sense because it's of its roots, where it actually came from. So, the American Legion was initially founded in 1918, actually in France. It was initially founded by some officers in the army that so when you got to like the last year or so of the First World War, both sides of the war on both sides of the trenches, the German army, the French army, of course, famously the Russian army, were suffering like these horrific, like these insanely enormous mass desertions and mass campaigns of disobedience. Like entire units, entire regiments and divisions were refusing to follow orders and go over the trenches or over the top into no man's land to fight. Um, and at the same time, there's a lot of communist and socialist literature that was kind of making its rounds through the trenches, and a lot of soldiers were starting to get exposed to a lot of these ideas a little bit. It was motivating even more insubordination and mutinies. And the US military wanted to kind of stave that off from happening within their own ranks. And so they did that by um, a bunch of officers organized the American Legion, and um, they'd host like parties and they'd host like sporting events for the soldiers to do while they were in the trenches. Like they'd get little breaks and they'd be able to go out, spend some of their get a little break from all of the action and go behind lines for a little bit, um, play some games, sing some songs, like stuff like just do activities and stuff like that. And so it was founded at its very inception to prevent, with the goal in mind, to prevent the spread of communism throughout the ranks of the U.S. military. And once it got back home after the war was over, a lot of the veterans or a lot of the veterans who were the soldiers who founded the Legion in the first place ended up going into business and into finance and became Wall Street and corporate guys. And they were still in charge of the Legion. And so, in the aftermath of the First World War, if you'll remember back to our Lucy Parsons episode, that's when a lot of the that's when the first Red Scare was in full swing. That's when a lot of legions were starting to be or when a lot of unions were starting to be cracked down on. And one of the most effective strike breaking organizations in the country during that time was the American Legion. That was one of their main activities as an organization at that time was as strikebreakers. So that's a little bit about the background of the American Legion as we get into the story. So these two guys, Gerald McGuire and Bill Doyle, two wealthy members of the American Legion, both from leadership within the Legion itself. They came to Butler and they told him that they were very concerned about the leadership in the American Legion, and they wanted to, there's a convention in Chicago coming up where they're going to elect new leadership in the Legion at the national level, and they wanted to go and they wanted to kind of shake things up, bring some leadership that, in their words, help the veterans more, make give them some leadership that would be more push harder for the things that veterans need. Also, this is a couple of rich assholes. I don't know, how do you want to handle that?
They all came up at the same time, so we'll just do it as one.
Prost.
Kampai.
So yeah, they're coming to Butler and they are asking him to help use his influence within the veterans community to push the convention to elect better leadership. Butler was, of course, he was sympathetic to the general idea, though he didn't think that they quite had what he did in mind. Um, but he was still like sympathetic to the idea of getting some new leaders, shaking up the leadership within the Legion. But he didn't want to get involved in the politics of it all. That wasn't his thing. He'd never liked that kind of. It's why he wasn't really involved in a lot of veterans organizations besides the VFW.
Makes sense.
More than that, he was really suspicious of these guys because they were very obviously part of the business class that he hated so much.
I mean, duh.
Yeah. And so he politely declined and the two men went on their way. A month later, they returned, and this time they didn't just want him to attend the convention in Chicago. They wanted him to crash it with 300 uninvited rank and file legionaries who would who would all back up his push for new leadership within the Legion. So now Butler knew that they were up to something. This was not a normal request. And so without giving them a clear answer, he was trying to string them along and try to pry as much information out of them as he could. When they thought that he might be considering it, they gave him a draft of a script for the speech that they wanted him to read at the convention. And so he took the copy of the script, he sent them on their way, and then as they left, he was reading over it. And it's a speech to a veterans organization. He thought it might be like the speech would be directed to, addressing the bonus or addressing like veterans of like developing veterans affairs division, like Veterans Affairs Bureau within the federal government, stuff like that, like actual stuff that would impact like the rank and file of the Legion.
It did not.
He read over it, but instead, the entire script for the speech was going to be urging the Legion to push for the federal government to readopt the gold standard for the US dollar. And I know that's not going to make any sense. Let me try to explain it very briefly. When FDR came to power, when he entered the presidency, one of the first things that he did as part of his New Deal platform was that he took the US dollar off of the gold standard, which just means that the gold standard was that all of the currency in the US was like all of the printed money in the United States would be equivalent in value to all of the gold that the US federal government had in its reserves. And so every dollar was pegged to a certain amount of actual physical existing gold. And so the general idea behind doing that was that if it's back to a certain amount of gold, then it'd be more stable. It wouldn't just be free floating. It was subject to significantly less inflation and deflation and things like that. But at the same time, there was only so much money that you could print, because once you got to a certain point, then like if you printed too much money too fast, then that would just mean that the gold itself would start to be worth less, if I remember correctly. But it limited the amount of money that you could actually physically have in circulation. And that wouldn't do for the New Deal as it was coming about, because the FDR administration would need as much money as they possibly could to fund all of these programs that they were enacting. And so one of the first things that he did was he took the US dollar off of the gold standard and made it a fiat currency. So it was just free floating. And so they could print out an enormous amount of money, like triple or quadruple the amount of money they already had in circulation. And they'd be able to pay for all of these government programs that they were enacting without a comparative amount of inflation being caused by it. But the rich and the powerful, all of the very conservative, like Wall Street business bankers, all those guys, were terrified of being taken off of the gold standard, because all of the money, all of the money that was put into these jobs programs were used to create value amongst the poor and unemployed and all of those kinds of people at the bottom of society. But they weren't getting any more money out of it. If anything, that oftentimes they're going to be taxed more, so they'd end up having less money. But then now that they were off of the gold standard, all of this money was being printed. It was causing quite a bit of inflation, so the value of a single US dollar was being decreased, which was fine for all of the poor people that these services were providing money to, because any money was better than what they had before, which was no money.
Yeah,
But it hugely impacted the rich and powerful of the country, because now all of the money that they had was worth less.
I bet that pissed them off.
Yeah. And here's the thing, it wasn't, in the long scheme of things, like in the broad picture, it wasn't worth that much less. They were still the richest and most powerful people in the country. But any little amount of power or wealth or influence that they could possibly lose made them lose their absolute fucking minds.
I'd argue it's still like that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you could take away, there's like 5 or 6 thousand people in this country where you could take away 99% of their wealth and their quality of life would not change a single bit. But if you ever propose the idea of ever doing that, they will
They lose their mind.
literally destroy your life to get you to stop. And so as the New Deal was going into effect, the big rallying cry against the New Deal was centered on restoring the US to the gold standard, and in their own words, restoring like like fiscally responsible economic policy. That's how they framed it. Was the New Deal is very economically irresponsible, and it's going to drive the country into economic ruin, and we need to restore the gold standard so we can put the US back towards fiscal responsibility, which was the exact argument that was being used to justify the Hoover administration doing nothing to address the depression, which had caused all of this suffering in the first place. And history has, of course, vindicated the New Deal, because it was the greatest expansion of economic prosperity in the entire history of the human race.
And yet they refuse to implement any policies even remotely similar to that nowadays.
Yeah, that was less than a century ago, and we still have people arguing that those same policies being done today would be an economic disaster, even though they've already demonstrated that they're way better than anything we've got going right now. Anyways, so the third visit of these rich weirdos to Butler's house, it was just Gerald McGuire this time. So in this conversation, Butler pushed McGuire to reveal a little bit more information about who was financially backing the plan, because the plan was to transport 300 poor veterans from across the country all the way to Chicago in order to back Butler up in his plan to crash the convention. And that was a little expensive. He wanted to know like who was offering to pay for that. And so McGuire revealed a few names. The two that stuck out to Butler: retired retired U.S. Army Colonel Grayson Murphy, who was a co founder of the Legion and was now a stockbroker in New York City. And much to Butler's shock, had recently been awarded a medal for his extensive business connections with different industries in Italy. And he had received a medal for being a friend of the Italian people by Benito Mussolini himself.
It's just the connections that can be made throughout history that are kind of ambiguous whether they mean much or not. Is kind of crazy, you know?
Yeah. The second name that perked up Butler's ears was a guy named Robert S. Clark. Robert Clark was another veteran who had actually served alongside Butler during the Boxer Rebellion in China. He was another Marine, but in the Marine Corps, he had this he had a little bit of a reputation for cowardice. By all accounts, he was not very well liked by his fellow Marines. He kind of wasn't very good at leadership. He didn't do well under fire, that kind of stuff. He had the nickname the Millionaire Lieutenant because he was the heir to the Singer Sewing Machine Company, and he grew up in wealth. And it was speculated that he had received his commission in the Marine Corps through his father's connections.
Don't you love nepotism like that?
Yeah, that's another couple rich assholes.
Kampai?
Prost. So after giving Butler a few of these names, McGuire was trying to, still trying to push Butler to, not just at the Chicago convention, but like at while he was on some of his other speaking tours to like veterans organizations, start giving speeches talking about the gold standard and um, kind of pushing some of these veterans groups to start adopting a return to the gold standard, that kind of thing. Um, and he tried to bribe Butler with $18,000 in cash. $18,000, which seems like overkill for what he's asking him, for what McGuire's asking Butler to do.
It does, but I bet he knows he's asking Butler to compromise his morals.
Butler, of course, refused the bribe, but also gave no clear answer because he was still trying to string them along and get as much information out of them as he possibly could. And so after that, McGuire left. And a couple months later, the millionaire lieutenant that I mentioned, Robert Clark, visited Butler's house personally to talk to him. And they talked about the same stuff. They started off by talking about like their war stories, and they got into discussion of the convention in Chicago and the gold standards, all that kind of stuff. After some prodding, Clark revealed who had actually written that gold standard speech. The guy who had written it was a man named John W. Davis. John Davis was the chief attorney for J.P. Morgan and Company.
That tracks.
Clark also revealed that the gold standard push in the Legion was indeed part of a larger plan. He explained that the gold standard issue was meant to begin mobilizing the American Legion into a lobbying group. They wanted to organize veterans to pressure Roosevelt to repeal New Deal policies.
Can I just say real quick that I think lobbying is evil and immoral?
Oh, yeah, it's legalized bribery. Yeah, so Butler, when he heard about this idea, he of course flew into a rage at the idea and he sent Clark packing empty handed. Butler would ultimately not give a gold standard speech at the convention in Chicago. What happened instead is fucking crazy. I cannot believe this happened. Instead, the conspirators spent tens of thousands of dollars buying telegrams so that they could spam the convention as it was meeting. And they sent thousands of telegrams purporting to be from legionaries from across the country demanding that the convention adopt a platform of pushing the federal government to readopt the gold standard.
That is the that's so stupid that it reminds me of a comic book thing. So in Batman, the second Robin's name was Jason Todd. And when they went to have an event where they were thinking about killing him off, they actually had a telephone call contest to see if Robin would live or die. You know what happened? Someone robo dialed for him to die like a bunch, but it still ended up being like, I think it ended up being close. I can't, don't quote me on it being close. That they killed him. They eventually brought him back, and he became Red Hood, which honestly was an amazing take for the character, in my opinion. But it was literally just some obsessed fanboy.
Oh yeah.
It's like, I hate Jason Todd. Let's kill him.
And you know what? You want to know what's even dumber about this whole plan is it worked.
Of course it did.
So a motion was made at the convention, and it passed overwhelmingly that the Legion would have formally adopt a return to the gold standard as one of its organizational platforms. There was no similar motion made to push for the payout of the veterans bonus.
Of course not.
Of course not.
Because that would give them economic power to do stuff with outside of being controlled.
Yeah, the American Legion was easily like the most big business like puppet of Wall Street sort of veterans organizations that existed at the time. The VFW was and still kind of is like halfway decent. Like just a generally like apolitical organization. They're just focused on creating like camaraderie amongst veterans to share their experiences and get some cheap beer on the weekends. Like I can't argue with I the VFW is fine. I don't mind them at all. Um, so in August 1934, which was about a year later, Butler once again met with Gerald McGuire at a hotel in Philadelphia. And McGuire wanted to meet because he was just fresh off of an extended trip to Europe. So he'd spent like 9 months in Europe. He'd just been traveling around. He'd been the guest of several veterans groups in France and in Germany. In this conversation, he tried to explain Butler about the magical things that the fascists were accomplishing in their governments across the pond, about how these countries had been rejuvenated by fascist government, and how it was all made possible by the good patriotic spirit of veterans organizations, that kind of thing. And McGuire explained that he and his partners were interested in creating a big tent veterans super organization. They wanted to make one big veterans group that would unite all of the different other organizations so that they could unite these vets from across the country into one structure to become a united front that would push for political goals. Of course, he was starting to kind of piece things together, but he still couldn't quite believe like where this was headed. He couldn't. He needed more information. He needed to press. He just kept pressing and pressing and pressing, trying to get more out of McGuire. Finally, he finally came clean. He finally admitted what this whole thing was about, the whole conspiracy. He explained that this big tent super organization, they intended to make this group a second bonus army.
Of course they did.
And this second bonus army would this time around be a lot larger and a lot better armed. And in emulation of Benito Mussolini and his march on Rome, they were going to march on Washington, D.C. And then at bayonet point, they would give a little recommendation to President Roosevelt that he use his executive power to create a new position in the presidential cabinet. This position would be the Secretary of General Affairs. And the secretary would run the government for the president. And using the veterans organization, the secretary would repeal New Deal policies and restore fiscally responsible and business friendly economics to the country. In completely blunt terms, this organization was going to march on the capital of the country, overthrow the president to turn him into a figurehead, and install a fascist dictator.
Yay, fascism.
And they were asking Major General Smedley Butler to be the dictator.
Holy shit.
They were asking him to lead the army and to take the position of Secretary of General Affairs and to run the US government towards a fascist pro business policy.
Jesus Christ.
He explained McGuire explained that Butler was the only officer in the entire nation with the popularity and the charisma to mobilize an army of veterans. But he elaborated on like what their backup plans were a little bit. He said that if Butler refused, then next they would end up going to um, a guy who is a little bit more ideologically predisposed, a guy named Douglas MacArthur.
Of course. Of course.
So at this time, Douglas MacArthur was the chief of staff of the army, but his term as chief of staff was about to be up. So whenever a chief of staff was appointed by the president, their they would have a term limit, or they would have a term, like a certain number of years that they would stay in the position. And there wasn't a constitutional law or a policy or anything, but up to this point, there had never been a chief of staff of the army who had ever succeeded themselves for 2 terms in a row. Every time that a chief of staff ended their term, a new one was chosen by the president. Butler was obviously very. A reason I'm explaining this. Butler was obviously very, very like incredulous at the. He was blown away. He was kind of like panic. He almost had a panic attack.
He was like the audacity of this bitch.
Yeah, it's just like his mind could not wrap itself around what it was he was being told. And he was incapable, constitutionally incapable of believing it. And so McGuire told him, like, you just go ahead and watch the news. A couple things are going to happen. First, we're going to make a super organization. We're going to announce this organization is being developed. And then the second thing is that MacArthur is going to be the first chief of staff of the army to serve a second term in a row, to be reappointed for a second term.
Okay.
And the reason he would be is because MacArthur was the son-in-law of a higher up at JP Morgan. And JP Morgan had a lot of influence in the federal government and would push to keep him in power, to keep him in his position.
That tracks.
And so with MacArthur kept in power, if they approached MacArthur and he agreed to participate in this takeover, then he would have then this army wouldn't just be an army of veterans, it would be the actual US Army behind them as well.
Basically, yeah.
McGuire also revealed that this army of veterans would be kept armed and mobilized for a year, for a total of 1 year after the president had been overthrown, and that they would be armed and paid by JP Morgan.
So JP Morgan would have like a private military, basically.
Yes. And they also explained that the organization that they were planning on making this turning into this new army would be founded by the Democratic governor of New York, Al Smith.
Of course it was.
So, of course, Butler, like I said, completely incredulous, thought that McGuire was a complete nutcase and was kind of regretting giving him all of this time for like the last year and a half that they had been kind of talking about this stuff. Was kind of regretting, like, why did I commit so much of my time and energy to this? This guy's a nutcase. And then a few weeks later, about 3 weeks later, sure enough, just as sure as McGuire said, MacArthur became the first chief of staff of the army to succeed himself in American history. A few days after that, Butler read in the newspaper about the founding of a new organization called the American Liberty League, which was being founded by Democratic governor of New York, Al Smith.
Why is it that all the famous attempts to overthrow the U.S. government are always really right wing, and we don't have any good attempts from the left?
Um, because the federal government has always put more energy and money and time into suppressing the left. And so the left has never had as much institutional power as the right. And because the right always has the backing of the richest and most power, some of the richest and most powerful people in the country, whereas the left is all just grassroots working class people.
Yeah, yeah, that tracks.
So the right, yeah, the left has always and will always rely on sheer force of numbers and the fact that um, we are the people who that like working class people are the people who make everything run. And so it doesn't matter how much money any of these rich assholes have. If we could all just collectively decide to set down or just sit on our ass for a day, um, and not do any work, we'd have this. We it's it's like it's like one of the union guys I mentioned in the Lucy Parsons episode, uh, Big Bill Haywood.
Mm-hmm. I remember Haywood.
He once said that all the working class has to do is stick our hands in our pockets, and we've got the capitalist class whipped. It's that kind of thing. Like without us, nothing runs, nothing works. If we all just stopped, all of their power and influence and authority means nothing. And that is always that, and just the sheer strength of numbers is always where the left's power has lied. But the right already has connections within the established economy, within the established political system, with all of that. And so they're always going to be a few steps ahead of any left wing movement. So that's why all of like that's why the right has always been significantly more powerful than the left in the United States.
It tracks doesn't mean I have to be happy with it.
It's oh no, it's a fucking nightmare. It's big part of the reason why we're in the state that we are now. Um, but anyways, so the American Liberty League, this organization that's being announced, that Butler's just sitting, he's getting out of bed one morning and opening up his newspaper and reading about this organization that's being founded, and the newspaper lists out all of the corporations and businessmen that are so generously giving their financial backing to this new organization. Let me give you a list real quick.
Okay, hit me with it.
Of course, we've already mentioned J.P. Morgan,
To be assumed.
to be assumed. The Pitcairn family, which owned Pittsburgh Plate Glass, which was a pretty big business at the time.
I have no idea who that is.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of them before either, but they're one of the richest families in the country at the time. Um, a lawyer, banker, and a former secretary of the Treasury named Andrew Mellon. A few names you've heard of: the Rockefellers,
Fuck them.
fuck them. William Knudsen, who was a senior manager at General Motors. The DuPont family. Have you heard of them?
I've heard of them, but I can't remember what they're famous for.
The DuPont Corporation is a chemical corporation. They invented like a lot of like the plastics and polymers that they put in everything nowadays. And they were like top 3 or 4 wealthiest families
Damn.
in the country. And so the DuPonts are in on this. A guy named Joseph Pugh Jr., who is the president of Sun Oil Company, which is today Sunoco.
Okay. Does that count?
Yeah, I think all of these kind of counted, but we'll count it as one, I guess.
I'll count DuPont as one.
Yeah, let's just count this whole list as one. Prost.
Kampai.
But yeah, so this guy Joseph Pugh Jr., who's the president of Sun Oil Company, also a prominent leader in the Republican Party, and was also best friends with this guy named Robert Welch, who's not involved in this plot. But Robert Welch is the guy who would later go on to found the John Birch Society. So Butler's discovered that everything that all of these things that Gerald McGuire has explained were going to happen, the formation of this super organization, the reappointment of Douglas MacArthur as chief of staff of the army, all of this stuff has come to pass, and it bodes very darkly on it's it's confirmed in Butler's mind basically that well shit, McGuire is telling the truth about all of this stuff, and the American democracy might really be at risk of some sort of like fascist takeover
Why the fuck didn't he believe it before?
because it's fucking insane. It was a fucking ridiculous. It was one he'd been visited by two or three guys who were admittedly pretty rich and moderately influential, but definitely not like the high rungs of like the business class.
Well, I just kind of maybe it's a modern expected, but like I guess we kind of see how fragile our system is more modern because we can see the issues that happen. We can see everything that can happen from day to day where it could have just broken down here.
Another thing to keep in mind is that Butler, being this very famous and very popular guy, um, he had kind of an open door policy for his house. So any veteran who wanted to stop by his house and just meet with him and talk to him about whatever, his doors were always open. And so over the years, he gotten a lot of visitors, and more than a few of them had been kind of cuckoo and out of their minds and talking like, uh, you know, veterans at a time when
They were probably speaking more out their ass than they were actually speaking of what they actually believed.
yeah, a lot of them speaking out their ass, a lot of them like with dumb business idea, trying to get them on board with dumb business ideas, or even like there's a lot of mental illness, like a lot of mentally ill people coming around like trying to with like conspiracies, or trying to get them on board with like crazy sort of, he just heard a lot of crazy shit in his time. And so by this time he had kind of been, his natural reaction to hearing stuff like, yeah, we want you to help us overthrow the US government and install a fascist dictatorship, his natural reaction would be like even despite, even though this was like a different situation, like all of like he had a bunch of like paper trail for like money and transactions and stuff. He had no reason to believe that this wasn't just like the fever dream of a few random guys with a moderate amount of wealth.
He didn't think they had real standing, is what you're saying. He didn't think it was actually going to make it very far.
Right, yeah. And then all of this information came out, especially the organization, the American Liberty League, and had all of these names associated with it that were, um, the most powerful people in the United States. And so when that happened, Butler kind of went into full shit is about to hit the fan mode.
Can you blame him? No.
Oh, no, that's the appropriate response to this information. So he began reaching out to fellow leaders in the veteran community, including James Van Zant, who was the commander of the VFW. He started warning a bunch of them that they might be approached by the American Liberty League to help organize a coup on the White House. And he wanted, and all of the guys he talked to were like, okay, yeah, we're on the same page as you. If we're approached for this horse shit, um, we know we know exactly what to do. Don't worry. So so already he's ruining the pool. He's muddying the waters and kind of poisoning the well for this whole plan to get veterans on board. He's now has like all of like the major veteran leaders of the veteran community like, yeah, we're not going to let this happen. So immediately got that out of the way. um, he wanted to go public with all of this information that he already had, but he knew that if he did so without physical evidence, the actual like stuff that people could put their hands on, he would be ignored and he'd be the laughing stock of the country. If he
Because it sounds insane out of context. Because no one in their right mind wants to believe, hey, there might be an actual coup. Just like the people who supported Trump were like, there's no way there's actually going to be an insurrection, or there's no way this was actually meant to happen.
Yeah, and like after the fact of like the January 6th stuff, like there's a bunch of people that still believe that like that entire crowd of people who stormed the Capitol building were Antifa in MAGA disguises.
And they're fucking stupid if they still believe that. After the hearings.
Well, none of them watched the hearings. None of them took the hearings seriously.
And that's what we call burying our head in the sand and refusing to view reality.
Yeah, like the only way you can believe this kind of the kind of stuff that they do is if you have no you have to live in a bubble and you have to completely reject the idea that there is an objective reality, like something that you can measure and actually put your hands on and understand as like through like a logical lens. You have to. I mean, that's one of like Umberto Eco, his tenets of in his essay about fascism. One of like the main tenets was like a rejection of intellectualism and a rejection of I can't remember the exact phrasing he used. There were a few different points that kind of touched on it, but like the 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 fascist ideology is dependent on the idea of rejecting reality. It's dependent on the
And people wonder why most sane Americans are fucking done with the very deep right now.
yeah, and that's it's an intrinsic part of their ideology that like you you don't just reject the idea of like looking at the world objectively and with rationality and with kind of like a measured mind, kind of analyzing the way that things work and kind of drawing your conclusions based on observation, like the scientific method. It's not just a matter of like they don't just like reject that way of thinking, object the idea of objectively observing reality, but they have to believe that that way of thinking is morally wrong. That is what they actually believe, is that the idea that there is an objective reality that can be measured and understood, that belief is a moral failure. And so that's why they happily gobble up all of this conspiratorial thought, is because reality is whatever they want it to be. Whatever they whatever makes sense to them, no matter how wrong or unconfirmable or completely
Illogical it is.
it because the logic doesn't exist in their brain. Their idea of logic is like, well, it makes sense to me. It confirms everything that I've been taught to believe. It confirms my worldview, so it's logical. Yeah, so he knew. So Butler knew that if he tried to bring this information out in the open, he'd be a laughing stock. Especially if he was on his own. If it was just one guy trying to explain to the American public, yeah, there's a bunch of people trying to overthrow the FDR administration and install a fascist dictatorship. Everybody would see him as just a bitter old general making up senile lies to get back at a government who had snubbed his promotion, because that's how a lot of people and a lot of his opponents had framed him. Like a lot of his opponents saw him as
A bitter old man who got outcasted from the government.
like, oh, look at this guy complaining about like all the evil shit that we do to third world countries. What a fucking what a fucking idiot this guy. He's a pinko liberal. He knew that if he took this public, he needed it. He would like proof, but at the very least, he needed like another voice to corroborate, another respected voice to corroborate him. And so he approached an old friend of his. There's this guy named Paul Comley French, and French was a reporter who wrote for both the Philadelphia Record and the New York Post. He is a very well respected, award winning reporter who had been he had written very favorably about uh, Butler when he was the director of public safety in Philadelphia when he went off for a couple of years to play cop in Chicago for a little while. And so French, when he explained what was happening to French, this reporter was 100% on board. He's like, "Yeah, this is something we need to address, and we need to nip in the bud before it becomes a problem." And so he starts investigating all of the names that were involved, and it really seems like he kind of when you get into the investigative work that French actually did, it kind of because obviously there wasn't going to be a lot of like physical evidence that at least like just a private reporter would have access to. You'd need like the federal government.
Of course not. Like that was probably something that was very hard to prove.
Uh, at the very least, you'd need like the power and the investigative ability of the federal government, like the that kind of stuff, to be able to find the evidence that you needed to start to corroborate these claims. And so instead, what French did is he just threw a Hail Mary. And he went straight to Gerald McGuire, Robert Clark, and Grayson Murphy. He went to these three guys and he just straight up started asking them about the plot. He said he was a friend of Butler's and he was interested in learning more about this plot and how he could help. And for some reason, and this
They believed him, didn't they?
it fucking worked. They were extremely candid with. They were more candid with him than they were with Butler.
That's crazy that they were willing to tell him more than they were willing to tell Butler.
Yeah, not only did they confirm everything they had told Butler, but they also revealed that some other information. So they also revealed that most of the former commanders of the American Legion had been approached to support the plot. They didn't reveal whether or not they had actually accepted it or not, but this was like a whole laundry list of more names, all of them like the highest levels of the American Legion potentially involved in the plot. They also revealed that McGuire's 9-month trip across Europe to study fascist movements. That trip had been funded by J.P. Morgan.
Of course it was.
Of course it was. Yeah, J.P. Morgan was balls deep in this entire plan.
Imagine that timeline. The timeline where JP Morgan installed a fascist government.
Yeah, it's fucking wild. Um, and they also confirmed that um, or they also revealed that the this army of veterans that they planned to use to march on DC, they would all be armed using firearms that would be purchased from Remington, the Remington Firearm Company. It would be they would be bought from Remington using credit that they would get from the DuPont company.
This web just keeps on expanding, doesn't it?
Oh yeah. So with all of this information, Butler and French approached there's this House of Representatives committee. It was called the McCormack Dickenstein Committee, which is named after the two representatives who ran the committee. It was this committee. It was a precursor to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Have you heard of that one?
The House Un-American Committee, not that I remember, but it does sound vaguely familiar.
Like McCarthyism, the Red Scare of the 1950s.
Yeah, I remember the Red Scare. I just couldn't remember if that's what they called it or not.
Yeah, that was the all of the 1950s Red Scare that was directed by Joseph McCarthy. Joseph McCarthy was the chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And so this committee, the Cormac Dickenstein Committee, was the precursor to that. And this committee had been formed to investigate threats to the US government from extremist factions from both sides of the political spectrum. But at this time, they were mainly concerned with rooting out Nazi propaganda, because the Nazis in the early to mid 1930s were really pushing like a lot of their propaganda within the American public to try and
No shit.
sway. like the German American Bund was fucking enormous. It was a huge political force during this time. Have you ever heard of the German American Bund?
I have not.
Um, it was a party made up of Americans of German descent.
I figured that.
Yeah, it was basically like an American Nazi party um, made up of like German Americans, and it became really famous. Like it like today, whenever people are talking about like fascism in America, um, one of the one of the some of the pictures and the videos that they talk about and they show is like there's this really famous meeting of the German American Bund at the um I forgot what it's called. It was this giant stadium in New York, but there were like 20,000 attendees to this giant rally in New York in
Damn.
like 1930, somewhere around this time, like 1934, I think. And there's this really famous picture of like the whole stadium, and the stage has like a giant portrait of Abraham or of George Washington that's flanked by like two giant swastikas on each side.
Jesus Christ.
And it's always been it's a picture that always comes up whenever people mention like fascism in the U.S. Um, but so Butler and French come to the McCormack Dickenstein committee, and they hear the two men's testimony on November 20th, 1934, in a secret session. Using their testimony, the committee they investigated the financial records of all of the names involved in the conspiracy. And they discovered that Robert Clark had given Gerald McGuire $30,000 in credit, which had been wired through J.P. Morgan and Company. And McGuire hadn't been able to account for this money. He couldn't explain like where this money had gone that he had received.
Good old taxes.
it was it's presumed that that money was used for his trip to Europe, that he used to study fascism in Europe.
Sounds about white.
McGuire claimed that he and Clark had never expressed any interest to one another in forming a fascist organization in the United States. That was disproven. So during their testimony, they explained that they never had any interest and then never expressed interest in it to each other. That was disproved because the committee found a bunch of letters that McGuire and Clark had sent back and forth between each other, discussing how they would form a fascist paramilitary in the United States. And so that was the first
And this is kids, is why you never write anything down.
and that was the first lie that McGuire was caught in. He got caught in several over the course of this investigation, including a claim that he couldn't have possibly tried to bribe Smedley Butler because at the time that Butler claimed that they were meeting, uh, McGuire had been in Chicago at the time because that was when the convention was about to start. The American Legion convention was about to start. That was disproven because McGuire had withdrawn the same amount of money as the amount that he had tried to bribe Butler with, $18,000, had withdrawn that money in cash from a bank in Newark, New Jersey, where they were meeting.
Don't leave proof, dumbass.
so he so they confirmed that he was not in Chicago and that he lied about being in Chicago at the time.
It's like they don't know how to cover the tracks.
They also discovered that the telegrams that had been sent to the American Legion convention in Chicago had in fact been paid for by McGuire using $45,000 given to him by Robert Clark, and that they also confirmed that Clark himself had been an intermediary for several large money exchanges made between different companies implicated in Butler's testimony, including JP Morgan and DuPont. Yeah, so a lot of very damning evidence that there was very much a plot and that this plot was interested in forming a fascist paramilitary to overthrow the government of the United States.
Sounds like this dumbass doesn't know how to cover his tracks.
Oh yeah, McGuire is the perfect example of like the fascist mindset because like very competent in some things and then wildly stupid and just a complete fucking idiot in in basically everything else. And so when the news broke of all of these allegations, the press went absolutely fucking wild.
As they should.
Yeah, Butler's testimony was front page news across the country. But keep in mind, the newspapers are owned by friends of all of the people implicated.
As they usually are.
And so all of the papers seemed like they were angling against him a little bit. The articles didn't waste much ink talking about Butler's accusations themselves or any of the evidence behind them, but it took up the bulk of these articles listing out every one of the conspirators' denials and their quotes, their responses to it. And so you'd have like one little blip at the very beginning that says like Smedley Butler has testified that such and such has that this group of people has been implicated in a conspiracy to overthrow the government. And then the entire rest of the article is just basically like giving all of the people accused all of the space to explain why they're not involved in it.
Of course. Sounds about capitalist.
The media and the business world kind of painted him as a lunatic. They, in fact, they called this testimony a publicity stunt. They thought he was just trying to get attention. But the committee and the Roosevelt administration itself took the allegations dead seriously, as did as did other veterans organizations outside of the American Legion, especially the VFW. The VFW threw their full support behind Butler, like very publicly. Also, the commander of the VFW, that guy James Van Zant, uh, he gave his own testimony and confirmed that he had also been approached. Like after Butler had told him to told him that there was this conspiracy, just a few days later, Van Zant himself had been approached, and he confirmed everything that Butler had said. The American Legion had very little to say about this whole situation because so many of their own members were implicated, and so they kind of just slink into the bushes like that Homer Simpson meme.
Just like, back away, back away.
On February 15th, 1935, Congressman McCormack submits the committee's findings to Congress, which confirmed that the committee had it states that the committee had confirmed all of General Butler's accusations. So Butler is vindicated, and the federal government is fully like 100% aware of this entire plot. But there's still some weird shit going on. Still, but the weird stuff was about the committee itself, the about this whole investigation.
Were some of the committee in on it?
They weren't in on it, but here I'll explain. Many of the names which had come up in the investigation, including several of the former commanders of the American Legion, a lot of those names hadn't been subpoenaed for questioning, and there's no explanation why. And whenever any journalist would attempt to investigate why none of these names have been subpoenaed, they kept running into brick walls, just walls of silence from everybody involved in the investigation. And this wall of silence was very obviously put up by members of Roosevelt's administration itself. Like this was a federal level.
Why was Roosevelt involved?
I'll get into my theory a little bit. It was noted that several of the names that were implicated, including Al Smith, the governor of New York, were prominent members of the Democratic Party. And so it's speculated that these journalists were blocked from investigating by the Roosevelt government to keep heat off of the Democratic Party. That's one theory.
Do you believe it?
I'm inclined to not believe it because I there's another theory that my theory is that um there's a couple possibilities. One is that the New Deal was very unpopular with the business class, and the business class was still a very powerful part of the American body politic. Like American politics, you could not escape the influence of Wall Street and business and bankers. It wasn't happening, and so um, there's one possibility that the Roosevelt administration had shored up, had agreed to let some of these potential charges go in exchange for the cooperation of the American business class with the New Deal.
Yeah, like they would have actually cooperated.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking is that no matter how good a deal it would have been, I seriously doubt that a lot of these people would have had the rational enough thinking to take a deal like that. Because that would have been a best case scenario for them. What I think actually happened, what I lean a little bit more towards is that it wasn't an offer so much as it was Roosevelt hanging a sword over their necks, basically saying like, yeah, we've got some of your most powerful people, some of your most powerful business interests nailed to a wall here, and we can throw them behind bars at the drop of a hat if we so choose, and they're going, and the charges will stick. So if you don't want that to happen, if you don't want all of your business associates or yourself thrown behind bars, you are going to fall into lockstep behind all of the policies that we're implementing right now. That is what I'm leaning more towards thinking what happened is that Roosevelt sacrificed the possibility of having a very public dis like a public dismembering of American fascism in the form of like a public trial and things like that, and a public destruction of the reputation of the business class and Wall Street within the American public. All of that,
That would have been a beautiful timeline to view.
that would have been a beautiful timeline. I think he gave that up so that he could use it as a bargaining chip to get those people on board with the New Deal, to kind of force their hands.
Honestly, I kind of agree with you.
So some other stuff, some other sketchy stuff that happened in regards to all of this. Um, the investigation wasn't actually complete. They didn't do a full investigation. The congressional appropriations for the committee, the House appropriations, had expired for the McCormack Dickenstein committee. They had expired and had not been renewed at the behest of the president, and so they had to cut their investigation short because they no longer had the authority of being the committee, because the committee was just like it hit its end date and it wasn't renewed, and so it stopped being a committee, it stopped existing, and so they had to cut their investigation short. Also, when they had released their public when they released the public transcript of Butler's testimony to the committee, a bunch of the parts that implicated like specific names were omitted.
Of course it was.
Also, the worst part was that nobody was prosecuted. Yeah. Not even Gerald McGuire, who at the very least had been caught lying under oath in his testimony several times, like verifiably, like out in public. Not even he got any jail time. So, whatever the case, whatever was the case with what was going on in the Roosevelt administration, because we still don't know. We have no fucking idea like what happened. We're never gonna know. Yeah.
And they're not going to tell us.
Whatever the case was, the entire episode fell out of the public eye very quickly. But for what it's worth, there was never a fascist takeover of the United States, at least yet, at least not in the 1930s. So after this, Butler spent the next several years continuing his speaking tours. He was still, of course, railing against interventionism, big business, still organizing veterans to lobby for benefits. One of his big talking points during his time, I fucking love this. One of Something that he started harping on a lot during this time was that he had this idea for two new amendments that he thought should be added to the Constitution.
which were
One of them, he said, uh, one amendment would make it illegal for the U.S. military to be deployed more than 50 miles beyond the country's border.
interesting.
Yeah, so it'd be a purely defensive military.
I can see definite scenarios, even if you're wanting a purely defensive military, where that wouldn't necessarily work.
Yeah, like um like a big part of like military readiness relies on like alliances, and you'll be obligated to have to like back up your allies like overseas, uh in or not just to defend them, but if they get overrun.
I wasn't just talking about that. I was just talking about like, hey, someone very makes it clear that they're going to keep attacking you. You can't just only be on the defensive, but like someone else starts the war. You can't just assume you fight off one battle and assume that you've won.
Yeah, I understand where he's coming from though, because like up to this point, the last time that the U.S. military had ever been used defensively on its own territory was the War of 1812. And since then, the U.S. military had been exclusively used in offensive wars in other countries overseas to devastating effect, which Butler had witnessed firsthand because he actively participated in it. So I understand where he's coming from. And I don't actually, actually think that, like, in the long run, this would be a net positive for the entire human race if this constitution had actually gone through. But I understand like why it wouldn't be feasible. Also, it is of course like many things. It's a very complicated topic, and of course these amendments he was proposing were like more talking points than like a serious proposal. But
Nothing's ever that easy, unfortunately.
the second amendment that he proposed would require that any declaration of war made by the U.S. government would be decided by a referendum vote of the U.S. population, but the vote would be restricted to men of military service age. So between about
Basically, the people who would be forced to fight the war.
so basically,
That's not a bad idea. Make the people who would have to fight your war.
yeah, no, there is yeah, there's no situation where that's a bad idea. uh, but during this time, especially after the business plot, he seemed to be becoming more radical during that time, like politically radical. He became acquainted with several left wing radicals, including this guy. He became very close friends with this guy named John Spivak. And Spivak was a journalist who wrote for a newspaper called the New Masses, which was the New Masses was heavily associated with Communist Party USA. And Spivak himself was a open and loud communist. Also, it's never been confirmed, but it has been speculated. It's a very real possibility that in 1936, Butler voted for in the 1936 presidential election. Butler voted for Norman Thomas.
I have never heard that name.
Norman Thomas was the presidential candidate for the Socialist Party of America, and he was Norman Thomas had been he was a minister, a Presbyterian minister from New York. He was a pacifist and an anti-war activist, and very, very, very anti-capitalist. And so it's very easy to see like how his anti-war credentials would have ingratiated him as a presidential candidate to General Butler.
Very easy.
In 1935, Butler wrote a short book, which I very much, Tim, to you I recommend, and to our entire audience recommend you read this book. It's like 70 or 75 pages long. It's not very long at all. It's called War is a Racket.
Just based on the title, I agree.
And he wrote this book in 1935. It was more or less like basically like like a compilation of all of his, or a combination of all of the different anti-war speeches he'd been giving over the last decade or so. And in the book, he describes how wars are directed and waged at the behest of corporations, and how the profit of these corporations is bought in the blood of American troops. Um, the last years of Butler's life were spent desperately promoting American neutrality in the Second World War. The Second World War had erupted on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. And he was terrified at the idea of America getting dragged into another war in Europe, because he had seen what had happened to America because of the first one. And he was terrified of the idea of all of these corporations and all of these businesses getting their slimy hands on this war and dragging us all along with them so that they could make a profit. That's always what he was concerned with. And so he spent a lot of his time in those last couple of years lobbying Congress to vote against any buildup of military industry. Now, at the time, most of the voices for neutrality in the Second World War um, were fascists. American fascists were they were the ones who were like, no, we shouldn't be fighting against fascists. But Butler was like the main voice from, like, I guess, like, kind of like from the left, arguing for neutrality. Like, yeah, fascism is an evil, but getting involved in a war is how you get fascism in America. That was his argument. Yeah, so he hated fascism with a burning passion. He didn't hate anything more than he hated fascism. And when he thought of fascism, he thought of Wall Street, and he thought of like cor-
To be honest, was he wrong?
no, he wasn't. But yeah, so that was the last few years of his life. That's what he was doing. He gave his very last anti-war speech of his entire life at Temple University on May 24th, 1940. The next month in June, he fell ill and he was taken to the Naval Hospital in Philadelphia. He was diagnosed with, he had some sort of abdominal condition. It was possibly colon cancer, but we're not sure. The doctors weren't even sure. But he was told that it was untreatable. And so a couple weeks later, he died surrounded by his family on June 21st, 1940. Just a few hours after, literally like 3 or 4 hours after he died, the French government formally surrendered to the Nazi military, the Nazi German military. Butler was buried in his hometown of Westchester, Pennsylvania. He's buried under a simple military headstone bearing his name, his rank, an engraving of the Medal of Honor, and the Marine Corps logo, or the Marine Corps motto in Latin, Semper Fidelis, or always faithful. The United States entered World War II 18 months later when the Japanese Navy bombed the naval station and dry dock at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
If there's anything that should have got them into the war, to be fair, it was Pearl Harbor, to be perfectly honest. After that, it's kind of hard to stay out of the war, even if you're just only after Japan.
At that point, they had more or less
they weren't fighting in the war, but they were definitely involved in it. Like they were giving enormous lend lease to. But yeah, less than 4 years after Pearl Harbor, the war would be over, and the United States would the Allies, the fascists would be beaten, the Allies would be victorious, and the United States would emerge as the most powerful political, economic, and military superpower on the planet. A position that it still holds more or less to this day. A quote from Major General Smedley Butler, and this is a little long, but bear with me. Quote, I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers in 1902 through 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. That's the end of the quote. But
I say we finish our beer for that many. Uh, finish our drink at the moment, at least, since you're working out of a single beer.
okay.
Because that was so many business interests. It's not even funny.
Yeah. Between the airline hijacking attacks on September 11th, 2001, and the withdrawal of the last American troops in Afghanistan on August 30th, 2021, the US government spent around $14 trillion to fund the military campaigns and occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. Almost half of that money went directly into the pockets of corporations, including Halliburton, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and General Dynamics. In Afghanistan, effectively nothing was accomplished as the Taliban were able to regain control of the country a few weeks after the American withdrawal. That was at the cost of 2,420 American lives and at least 200,000 Afghan lives. In Iraq, the nation's society was completely shattered by the US invasion. Infrastructure and government services were destroyed, and their economy was privatized and sold off to American corporations. The resulting mismanaged occupation and the corruption of the installed government caused ethnic and religious sectarianism, which created insurgencies and a low simmering civil war. Survivors of the US military's counterinsurgency coalesced into new, more powerful terrorist organizations, including ISIS. And the sudden dismantling of the military superpower of the Middle East, Iraq, destabilized the entire region, leading to numerous revolts and conflicts, most notably the Arab Spring and the resulting Syrian civil war. American dead from the Iraq War amount to 4,507, and the modern estimates put the death toll of the Iraqi people at over 1 million. Corporations still play an outsized role in the federal government's policymaking. In the last 2 decades, military contractors have spent over $2.5 billion on lobbying, and these companies currently have around 700 lobbyists active in Washington, D.C. While they lobby, the U.S. economy has been in gradual decline, with sharp drops in 2008 from the Great Recession and in 2020 during the economic slump caused by the COVID pandemic. As the quality of life for the average American has fallen, radicalism on both sides of the political spectrum has risen. Pro business, anti socialist, and ultranationalist political organizing resulted in the election of Donald Trump to the presidency in 2016, an administration which ended with a mob of angry nationalists storming the Capitol building on January 6, 2021, trying to force Congress to not ratify the election results of the 2020 presidential race. Though he's now out of office, the movements that brought him to power are still out there and growing more powerful by the day, and often funded by corporations like Koch Industries, run by the Koch brothers, Walmart, Home Depot, Tesla, Hobby Lobby, numerous investment firms and defense contractors, and practically every American oil company. That's it. That's what I got. Real quick before we sign off, the sources I use for this are "Plot to Seize the White House" by Jules Archer, which is an excellent piece of journalism. I will say it's a little bit biased. It whitewashes Butler's military history just a little bit. Which I didn't like, but it's still a very excellent piece of journalism. The second source I used is "Gangsters of Capitalism" by Jonathan Katz, which is fucking fantastic. It should be recommended reading for high school students. It's not amazing, entertaining read, fucking terrifying to read, and completely necessary for understanding the world that we live in today. So that's yeah, that's what I've got. Tim, what are plug
Well, first, where can they find you?
Oh yeah, they can find me on Twitter at Visigoth. The first I is a one, the O is a zero. Tim, where can they find you and the podcast stuff?
So they can find me at Tim, aka Otis, on Twitter. And then they can find the podcast at the Alexander Society Pod on Facebook and Instagram, and the Alex Society Pod on Twitter. And if they enjoyed us today, we would love it if they give us a rate and review on their streaming platform of choice.
Bye.